Millions of people wake up in the middle of the night for no obvious reason, no loud noise, no clear danger, just sudden awareness in the dark. As if some ancient alarm inside the human body still refuses to go silent. But what if this strange habit is not a flaw of modern life at all? What if it is a survival echo from a world where sleeping too deeply could get you killed? If you enjoy deep history, human mystery, and thought-provoking science, please like the video and subscribe to the channel before we go deeper. It happens in an instant. A body that should be resting rises toward consciousness, as if tugged by an invisible thread. The room is dark, the walls familiar, the hour unreasonable. Nothing obvious is wrong. No crash outside, no hand on the shoulder, no visible threat at the edge of the bed. And yet the heart is already a little faster than it was a moment ago. The ears seem to switch on before the mind does. The body listens first, thinks later, for a few suspended seconds. There is only the strange fact of being awake, pulled out of sleep for no clear reason, stranded in the middle of the night with the unsettling sense that some ancient signal has been received and obeyed. This is one of the most ordinary experiences in human life, and also one of the easiest to misunderstand. In the modern world, uninterrupted sleep is often treated as the natural standard, as if the ideal human night should resemble a machine shutting down and restarting only at dawn. Anything else can feel like failure. People lie still beside digital clocks that accuse them in cold numerals. They glance at the ceiling, count the shrinking hours before morning, and begin quietly negotiating with their own biology. But the more closely the problem is examined, the stranger that modern expectation begins to look. Human sleep is not a simple switch. It is not a sealed vault. It is not, and perhaps never was, fully cut off from the world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Long before cities, before written language, before walls thick enough to mute the wind, human beings sleep in places where the dark is alive with information. The night is not empty space between one useful day and the next. It is territory. It has weather, movement, temperature shifts, distant calls, the crack of branches, the hiss of grass, the breathing of others nearby, the subtle fading of embers, the possibility of teeth, floodwater, enemies, insects, cold, and fire in such a world. Sleep cannot be absolute. A creature that drifts too deeply, too blindly, for too long may not leave descendants. This does not mean that ancient humans are forever panicked, jolting awake at every sound. It means something more practical and more enduring. Their sleep, like their bodies, is shaped by compromise. Rest is necessary. Vulnerability is dangerous. The solution produced by evolution is not perfect peace, but flexible vigilance. That compromise may still live inside the modern nervous system. A person wakes at 2:17 in the morning, not because there is a predator beyond the curtain or a storm crossing the plain, but because the machinery that once helped ancestors survive is still running, adapted to one world and inherited into another. The bedroom may be safe by any rational standard, but the body does not operate only on rational standards. It operates on layers. Some are recent deadlines, grief, alcohol, temperature, stress hormones, a heavy dinner, an argument that ended badly at sunset. Others are older than memory. They belong to a human design assembled over immense spans of time, inside camps, caves, grasslands, coastlines, forests, river valleys, and brittle cold landscapes where survival often depends on noticing the wrong thing one moment before it becomes fatal. The mystery becomes more interesting the further back the story goes, because for most of human existence there is no such thing as a truly private night. Sleep happens near kin, near strangers, near children, near noise. It happens with smoke in the air and animals close by. It happens in temporary shelters, beneath hides, beneath woven roofs, beneath stars. It happens after exhaustion, but rarely under conditions of total security. A waking human today may feel alone in the experience, as if something has malfunctioned in the body's timing. Yet what survives in the record suggests that fractured sleep may be less an error than a trace, a fossil behavior still moving inside living tissue. The deeper one looks, the less this becomes a question only about sleep, and the more it becomes a question about what kind of creature a human being actually is. Humans are unusual in many ways. They are social to an extreme degree, dependent on cooperation, unusually slow to mature, and capable of reshaping environments on astonishing scales. But beneath cities and electricity, beneath medicine and locks and insulated walls, they remain animals who evolved under risk. The human brain is often described as a prediction engine, and in one sense that is true. It is always modelling what comes next, always balancing rest against readiness, by night. When vision weakens and certainty shrinks, that balancing act becomes more delicate. A mind can sleep, but some part of it may continue to patrol. There is an uncomfortable elegance in that possibility. What feels like a defect may once have been protection. The sudden nighttime awakening may not be a modern curse imposed on an otherwise peaceful species. It may be the leftover rhythm of a species that never had the luxury of vanishing completely into unconsciousness. Scholars still debate exactly how much of modern sleep disruption is inherited and how much is amplified by recent conditions. Because the evidence remains incomplete and direct windows into prehistoric nights do not exist. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, but the broad outline is difficult to ignore. Humans are not descended from creatures who slept behind steel doors, climate control, and police response times. They are descended from creatures who slept in the open margins of uncertainty. Even now, the first moments after waking reveal something revealing about the hierarchy of the senses. The body does not usually begin by composing a coherent thought. It begins by checking. Is there sound? Is there movement? Is the air too warm? Too cold? Too still? Has something changed? This sequence is so fast that it often passes beneath conscious notice, but it hints at an ancient order of operations. Awareness emerges like a guard coming back on duty. Only afterward does the modern mind enter with its own burdens, asking whether there is enough time left to sleep, whether tomorrow will be ruined, whether something is wrong with the heart, the hormones, the room, the self. The ancient system notices disturbance. The modern system narrates it. That narration can make the experience worse. A brief waking, harmless in itself, becomes charged with meaning. The body surfaces for a minute, perhaps exactly as it has been designed to do, and the mind immediately treats the event as a problem demanding interpretation. This is one of the strange collisions between evolutionary inheritance and modern consciousness. Human beings are not only creatures with nervous systems, they are creatures who build stories about their nervous systems while lying inside them. They do not simply wake. They observe themselves waking. They judge it. They predict consequences. They fear the next day before it arrives. Under those conditions, a small midnight check of the environment can expand into a full encounter with dread. But behind that dread is a much older landscape, one that the modern room has not fully erased. It is a landscape in which darkness means exposure, where fire must be maintained, where infants stir, where the weather turns, where footsteps may belong to kin or to danger. In such a world, waking has logic. Even sleeping groups likely distribute risk across many small vulnerabilities. One person shifts, another half wakes. Someone adds wood to a dying fire. Someone listens. Someone notices that the air has changed or that rain is beginning to move in. Night is not a dead zone in human history. It is a long theatre of low-level adaptation, and sleep within it is active in ways modern people rarely like to imagine. There is also the matter of memory, though not memory in the ordinary sense. A person does not carry an explicit recollection of ancestral nights, any more than a bird remembers the first forest its lineage crossed. What is inherited is not seen but tendency, not image but bias. The body carries dispositions shaped by selection. It leans towards certain responses because those responses were repeatedly good enough to survive. A brain that occasionally rises toward awareness at the wrong time may pay a cost in comfort. A brain that never rises at all may, in harsher conditions, pay a greater cost. Evolution does not produce serenity. It produces adequacy under pressure. Often that adequacy feels, from the inside, inconvenient. This is why the mystery of waking at night opens into something larger than insomnia. It becomes a story about the unfinished relationship between modern life and ancient design. Much of civilization can be read as an attempt to reduce uncertainty walls against predators, roofs against rain, social rules against chaos, medicine against pain, clocks against confusion, electric light against the sovereignty of dark. Yet the body remains older than all of these solutions. It accepts some of them, resists others, and misunderstands many. It can live in apartment towers while still responding to changes in temperature like a camp sleeper. It can lie beneath a clean white ceiling while behaving as though the night remains partially negotiable and not entirely safe. What makes this particularly unsettling is that the old system is not entirely wrong. Modern bedrooms are safer than Paleolithic camps, but they are not sealed from all threat. Breathing can falter, blood sugar can dip, stress can sharpen the body at inappropriate hours. Noise travels through walls, a child cries, a partner turns, a distant siren rises and fades. The old readiness persists partly because the world never became completely predictable. Evolution rarely discards a useful alarm simply because the architecture has improved. It preserves tendencies until they become ruinously costly, and even then change is slow. So the person awake in darkness inhabits two timelines at once. One is immediate and personal: this room, this hour, this pulse, this unwelcome break in rest. The other is vast, stretching back through uncounted generations who slept lightly enough, often enough, to survive nights that modern people would find almost unrecognizable. The great strangeness is that both timelines meet in the same body. The ceiling overhead belongs to the present, the waking beneath it may not. By the time sleep returns, if it returns, the episode can seem almost trivial. Morning light reduces it. Coffee disguises it. The routines of the day crowd over the mystery and flatten it into complaint. But the event remains interesting precisely because it is so common. Human beings still wake in the night for no apparent reason, and what appears at first to be an empty malfunction may in fact be one of the oldest surviving habits of the species. The refusal to surrender consciousness for too long in an uncertain world. To understand that habit means stepping away from modern assumptions and into deeper time, into nights before glass, before clocks, before locked doors. when darkness is not a neutral background but a living condition, and sleep itself is one more way of staying alive. To understand why humans still wake in the night, it helps to leave the modern bedroom almost entirely behind and imagine what sleep looks like across most of human existence. Not the curated sleep of mattresses, blackout curtains, thermostats, and timed alarms, but the older version, the one practiced for tens of thousands of years by people with no illusion that darkness could be mastered. In that longer world, sleep is never just a private biological event. It is a negotiated state, fitted around cold, vulnerability, labour, other bodies, and the uneasy knowledge that the surrounding landscape continues to move while the sleeper lies still. For early humans, rest is precious because energy is expensive. A body that walks long distances carries children, searches for food, shapes tools, avoids injury, and endures changing climates cannot function without sleep. Yet the need for sleep does not erase the cost of becoming unconscious. That is the central tension. Every animal must solve it in some way. Some species hide, some perch, some stand, some sleep in short bursts. Some let half the brain rest while the other half remains active. Humans take a different path. They become social sleepers. They rely on the group, on fire, on shelter, on timing, and on the peculiar flexibility of their own sleep architecture. They do not escape danger. They distribute it. The oldest human nights are difficult to reconstruct in detail because no direct record survives of what it feels like to lie awake on a Pleistocene plain listening to windwork through grass. Archaeology can recover bones, charcoal, tools, cut marks, pigments, dwellings, footprints, and occasionally astonishing glimpses of daily life. But sleep itself leaves only indirect traces. Even so, what survives in the record suggests conditions very far removed from modern expectations. Early humans and their relatives sleep in caves at times, but caves are not perfect sanctuaries. They can be cold, damp, smoke-filled, unstable, and already occupied by other animals. Open-air camps offer flexibility and visibility, but little insulation. Rock shelters provide partial cover. Temporary structures of branch, hide, and fibre may protect against wind without creating anything like modern silence. Every arrangement is provisional. Every arrangement has weaknesses. This matters because the environment shapes not only whether sleep is possible, but what kind of sleep is adaptive. A person bedding down on animal skins near a hearth in a shallow shelter does not merely need to fall asleep. That person benefits from sleep that can be interrupted without total confusion, from the ability to surface quickly, orient fast, and judge whether waking needs to become action. In modern terms, this might sound like poor sleep. In evolutionary terms, it may simply be realistic sleep. The conditions under which human sleep evolved are not conditions that reward complete detachment from the world. The sleeping place itself tells part of the story. Before permanent architecture, humans rest where they can, often in small groups whose members vary in age, health, and sensitivity. Infants wake, older people shift position, someone coughs, someone returns late from relieving themselves or checking the perimeter. Fire needs tending, rain begins, a hide flap loosens, the temperature drops sharply before dawn, embers dim and require attention. These are not extraordinary disruptions. They are the normal texture of a night lived close to material reality. In such settings, the line between sleeping and waking may be less absolute than modern people assume. Sleep can deepen and lighten in waves, braided with brief moments of checking, adjusting, listening, and returning to rest. There is good reason to think this flexibility is ancient. Human sleep comes in cycles, moving through lighter and deeper stages rather than remaining in one steady condition. Modern sleep science describes these patterns with electrodes and graphs, but the pattern itself is older than any measurement. A sleeper does not disappear for 8 uninterrupted hours. The brain changes state repeatedly. The body rises and descends through forms of rest, some more vulnerable to disturbance than others. In a protected modern home, that cycling may pass unnoticed. In a prehistoric camp, it may align closely with the demands of survival. A lighter phase of sleep is not merely an obstacle to perfect rest. It may be the moment when the organism checks whether the world has changed. Even the ground beneath early humans works against modern fantasies of ideal sleep. Most of history offers no thick cushioning, no climate control, no separation between sleep and the hard facts of terrain. Bodies adapt to sleeping on packed earth, woven mats, hides, raised platforms, or rough bedding of plant material, but discomfort is never completely designed away. Temperature regulation becomes especially important. Night cold can be dangerous. Yet sleeping too close to a fire poses different risks. Smoke may help deter insects or predators, but it also irritates lungs and eyes. One lesser-known detail from anthropological work among small-scale societies is how sleep often remains responsive to ambient conditions modern sleepers barely notice. Slight changes in temperature, sound, or social movement can shift the night without ending it entirely. The social dimension is just as important as the environmental one. Humans are not solitary sleepers by inheritance. For most of the species past, people sleep near others. This arrangement creates security, but also complexity. The presence of others lowers some dangers while introducing constant small disturbances. A group can detect threats earlier than an isolated individual. At the same time, a group creates sound, movement, breath, odor, heat, and contagion. Sleep becomes collective in a way that is both protective and imperfect. One can imagine the ancient camp not as a place of silent unconsciousness, but as a field of staggered awareness, different bodies drifting through different depths of sleep, with one person more alert while another rests more deeply, though not according to any formal schedule. Scholars still debate how structured such patterns may have been, but the evidence remains incomplete. What seems likely is not rigid order, but fluid overlap. That fluidity may be crucial. In many traditional societies studied more recently, though never as exact stand-ins for prehistory, nighttime waking is not automatically treated as pathology. People rise briefly, speak softly, tend fires, check animals, nurse children, add coverings, then settle again. Sleep is embedded in life rather than isolated from it. This does not mean ancient people are somehow immune to fatigue or sleep problems. Harsh environments and illness could make nights miserable. It means only that the expectation of one long, seamless block of unconsciousness may be historically unusual, or at least culturally exaggerated. The old human night has texture. It contains interruptions without necessarily containing crisis. The deeper one looks, the more human sleep resembles a behavior shaped by place rather than by abstract ideal. A camp on a cold steppe produces one kind of night. A humid riverside settlement produces another. Coastal groups are tuned to tides and wind. Forest dwellers sleep amid layers of sound that city dwellers would find unnerving. High-latitude populations face long winter darkness and short summer nights. Tropical populations reckon with heat, insects, and sudden storms. There is no single ancestral sleep environment. There are many. Yet across all this variation, one principle remains consistent. The sleeping human body evolves not in isolation from the world, but in negotiation with it. This is where modern confusion begins. People often judge their sleep against a standard built partly by industrial timekeeping, medical simplification, and commercial promises of optimization. They expect efficiency. They expect a uniform nightly product. But ancient sleep is not efficient in that way. It is opportunistic, conditional, and responsive. It belongs to a creature that must rest without disappearing. That creature eventually invents houses and locks and quilts and alarm clocks. But the deeper template remains older. The body still cycles. The senses still keep partial watch. The mind still surfaces under stimuli so slight they can barely be identified by morning. There is also a paradox at the heart of pre-modern rest. The more exposed the human environment, the more important sleep becomes and the less perfect it can afford to be. Exhaustion impairs judgment, movement, healing, and social function. Yet total sensory shutdown is dangerous. Human beings resolve this paradox not by choosing one side, but by living in between. They sleep enough to recover, yet lightly enough, often enough, to remain recoverable to the world. That balance is costly. It may even explain why people can feel deeply tired and still wake at the smallest uncertainty. The system is not designed to maximize comfort. It is designed to get the organism through the night. When later civilizations begin to build more permanent sleeping arrangements, much changes, but not everything. Walls grow thicker, roofs improve, bedding becomes more specialized. Social rules emerge about household space, privacy, and order. Even so, the older pattern does not simply vanish. A human being can inherit technologies rapidly and biology slowly. That mismatch may be one reason the modern sleeper often feels divided. The cultural story says safety has been achieved. The nervous system remains less convinced. It is worth remembering how recent truly protected sleep is for most people. Even a few centuries ago, many households remain crowded, smoky, cold, noisy, and vulnerable to intrusion. Travel requires sleeping in exposed conditions. Armies, caravans, shepherds, fishermen, labourers, migrants, and the poor continue to sleep where comfort is secondary to necessity. The luxurious idea of uninterrupted sleep in a quiet individual room belongs to a narrow slice of humanity for a narrow slice of time. By the standards of deep history, it is an exception mistaken for a rule. So when a modern person wakes in darkness and feels betrayed by their own body, they may be measuring themselves against an expectation their species did not evolve to meet. The ancient night is still present beneath the modern one. It survives in the architecture of sleep cycles, in the body's responsiveness to change, in the ease with which consciousness rises toward listening before thought fully arrives. Humans once sleep in worlds that refuse to let them go entirely. That older arrangement leaves marks, not obvious marks like scars or bones broken and healed, but subtler ones, written into behavior, threshold, vigilance, and the fragile contract between rest and survival. And that is before considering what the night itself contains. Because ancient humans do not merely sleep in imperfect shelters, they sleep in landscapes crowded with signals, with predators, with weather, with other human groups, with sounds whose meanings must be learned quickly or paid for dearly. The darkness around them is not absence, it is information, and the sleeping brain, however deeply it rests, may never have fully forgotten that fact. That older arrangement only makes full sense once the ancient night is allowed to become crowded again. Modern people often imagine darkness as blankness, a passive backdrop emptied of detail once the lights go out. For most of human history, the opposite is closer to the truth. Night is not empty. It is thick with events that are harder to read. The world does not become still after sunset. It simply becomes more difficult to interpret, and that difficulty changes the meaning of every sound. A rustle might be harmless wind working through dry reeds, or it might be something approaching on padded feet. The difference matters, and the body learns that long before language is available to explain it. In exposed landscapes, this ambiguity is constant. Open grassland carries sound strangely at night. A distant movement can seem close. A nearby one can vanish into the dark. Forests hold their own problems. Branches settle. Leaves drag against one another. Insects pulse in dense patterns that establish a kind of auditory weather. Water moves over stone. Animals call to mates, rivals, offspring, or prey. Somewhere beyond the visible edge of camp, another creature is also listening, also testing the darkness for information. Night is not the absence of activity. It is the hour in which activity becomes selective, concealed, and often consequential. For a human sleeper, this creates a particular kind of evolutionary pressure. The danger is not merely that threats exist. The danger is that the signals preceding those threats are uncertain. A body that wakes only when danger has fully arrived may wake too late. A body that wakes occasionally at ambiguous cues may waste some rest, but it retains options. This is one of the harsh arithmetic problems that life keeps solving in imperfect ways. Total peace would be comfortable, but it can be costly in an environment where the world continues to shift beyond the firelight. The half-alert human nervous system begins to look less like a flaw and more like a compromise struck under pressure. Predators form the most obvious part of that pressure, though they're not the only part. For long stretches of prehistory, humans share landscapes with large carnivores capable of harming adults and carrying off children. Lions, hyenas, leopards, wolves, bears, big cats of many kinds, and scavengers bold enough to approach human refuse all shape the nighttime ecology in which people live. Exact interactions vary by place and period, and scholars still debate how often large predators directly threaten sleeping humans, compared with how often they merely haunt the margins of camp life. The evidence remains incomplete, yet even infrequent danger can shape behavior when the cost of ignoring it is so high. One successful attack in a generation is not trivial to the genes of those who endure it. There is a tendency in modern thought to assume that once humans master tools, fire, and cooperation, the old animal fear of the dark begins to recede. In reality, mastery is partial. Fire is powerful, but it is not magical. It discourages some predators and draws attention from others. It creates a protected circle while revealing how small that circle is. A hearth burning in the dark is both comfort and advertisement. It says there are humans here. It says there may be scraps, tools, children, stored food, sleeping bodies. Around that light, safety has edges, and edges are exactly where the imagination of the nervous system becomes most active. Weather belongs to the same theatre of uncertainty. A modern sleeper may wake because a room is slightly too warm. An ancient sleeper may wake because a change in air means something immediate is coming. Wind shifts direction. Rain begins in the distance. A storm moves over open ground with astonishing speed. Cold settles sharply before dawn. Smoke from a dying fire stops rising cleanly and begins to sit low in a shelter. In arid lands, a brief night chill can become severe enough to matter. In tropical regions, Humidity and insects can make rest shallow and repeatedly interrupted. The night presses on the body not only through threat, but through conditions that require constant micro-adjustment. Cover the child, move closer to the fire, turn away from the smoke, pull in gear before rain reaches it, check the embers, wake just enough to keep the environment from becoming a problem. Then there are other humans. This may be the most underappreciated element in the old night. Long before organized armies and walled cities, people live among allies, rivals, strangers, and neighboring groups whose intentions are not always knowable. Human beings are never only prey. They are also competitors, raiders, trespassers, and opportunists. A noise in the dark is not just an animal question. It may be a social one. Who is out there? Who has followed the group? Who wants access to water, food, territory, mates, or revenge? The body does not require a philosophical theory of conflict to react to such possibilities. It only requires repeated exposure to a world where waking at the right time improves the odds of survival. This helps explain why darkness itself acquires such power across cultures. It is not simply the lack of light, it is the condition under which meanings become unstable. Humans are visual creatures, heavily dependent on sight, and the night degrades sight first. In the dark, hearing rises in importance, smell becomes more informative, touch matters more, the mind begins filling gaps. A sleeping brain emerging toward wakefulness does not need a complete threat picture. It only needs enough irregularity to suspend full rest. In that sense, waking at night is not always a response to danger itself. It can be a response to ambiguity, which in ancient settings may be nearly as important. Anthropologists and sleep researchers looking at small-scale societies in recent times, while careful not to treat them as perfect windows into prehistory, have sometimes noted how responsive nighttime life remains to environmental cues. People rise to tend fires, check noises, comfort others, or react to changing conditions without necessarily describing these awakenings as abnormal. What looks from a modern perspective like interruption may once have been woven into the texture of ordinary night living. One lesser-known detail is that in some group settings, not everyone sleeps deeply at once. Without formal planning, ordinary differences in age, circadian rhythm, and sleep depth can create a kind of rolling awareness within the group. Someone is usually stirring, half awake, or easily roused. No single explanation fully accounts for how universal this pattern may be, but it suggests an appealing possibility the human camp may often remain more watchful than any single sleeper realizes. Even when direct threats are absent, the body may not know that absence with certainty. This is where modern people often misread their own experience. They assume that because no real danger exists in the room, the waking must be irrational. But ancient nervous systems do not depend on certainty. They depend on thresholds. They act when signals cross certain lines, not when modern consciousness has finished evaluating all evidence. A creak in the house, a shift in temperature, the sensation of having stopped hearing a familiar background sound, the slight change in a partner's breathing. Any of these may be enough to bring the organism upward toward awareness. By the time the rational mind arrives and finds nothing alarming, the older system has already done its work. There is also the simple fact that night contains opportunities for disaster even without predators or enemies. Fire can spread, a child can wander, an ember can die in dangerous cold. Stored food can attract scavengers, a shelter wall can loosen, water can rise. The sleeping group lives not in a sealed world, but in a system always vulnerable to small failures cascading into larger ones. Under such conditions, A species that wakes occasionally is not necessarily disadvantaged. It may be the species that remains alive long enough to complain, thousands of generations later, about waking for no reason. What makes this more than speculation is the convergence of common sense, evolutionary logic, and the fragmentary evidence left by human life before modern insulation. The archaeological record cannot show a graph of prehistoric awakenings. It cannot tell us how often a hunter-gatherer surfaced from sleep at the sound of hyenas or in response to cooling embers. But it does show that humans lived amid dangers for immense spans of time. It shows fire use, exposed camps, repeated mobility, mixed landscapes, shared sleeping spaces, and environments where night was active rather than inert. From that, one cautious inference follows selection is unlikely to favour a sleep pattern that requires absolute silence, absolute comfort, and absolute security, because those conditions almost never exist. This does not mean human beings are doomed to permanent night fear. Fear itself changes, culture changes, technology changes, fire becomes hearth, hearth becomes house, house becomes neighbourhood, neighbourhood becomes electrically lit city. Yet even inside these layers of protection, the body carries the older logic. It sleeps, but not as if it had evolved inside certainty. Somewhere beneath the blankets, beneath the habits of modern time, beneath the medical language of sleep hygiene and optimization, the organism still treats darkness as a live situation. That may be why the first seconds after a nighttime awakening feel so peculiar. They are often pre-verbal, almost ancestral in texture. The ears are open before thought is articulate. The body has already begun its assessment. Only then does the self arrive, irritated, confused, asking what went wrong. In truth, perhaps nothing went wrong at all. The system may simply be doing what systems shaped by long exposure to meaningful darkness tend to do. They sample the night, they check the edge. They rise briefly toward consciousness in case the world has changed. And for most of human history, the world often had changed. A predator may not be outside the bedroom now, a storm may not be crossing the ceiling, no stranger may be approaching through brush. But the architecture of waking does not belong only to the present room. It belongs to a much older world, one in which darkness keeps its contents hidden until the last possible moment. To sleep in such a world is never to abandon vigilance completely. It is to trust rest, but conditionally. It is to remain, even in sleep, a creature with one ear still turned toward survival. That conditional trust is written deeply into the biology of sleep itself. Human beings often speak of sleep as though it were a single uniform state, a descent into one continuous darkness from which the mind later returns. The actual process is more intricate and far less absolute. Through the night, the brain moves in cycles, rising and falling through different depths, alternating between heavier disengagement and lighter, more permeable forms of rest. These cycles are not modern inventions discovered by laboratories. Laboratories merely gave names to patterns that had always existed. For a species shaped in uncertain environments, such architecture makes a great deal of sense. It allows restoration, but not at a single fixed depth for the entire night. It allows the organism to disappear, but only in intervals. This is one reason the human sleeper can be so easily misunderstood, even by the self. A person goes to bed with the expectation of unconsciousness, and is surprised to discover that the body has other ideas. Yet the body is following a design that never promised total oblivion in lighter phases of sleep. The threshold between rest and wakefulness is thinner. A sound, a shift in temperature, a change in breathing, internal discomfort. or even no clear stimulus at all may be enough to lift the mind toward the surface. That rising is often brief. Sometimes it leaves no memory by morning. At other times it becomes fully conscious and therefore emotionally significant. But from the perspective of biology, the difference between these events may be smaller than it feels in the dark. Seen through evolutionary logic, this pattern looks less accidental than useful. An organism that alternates between depths of sleep gains flexibility. It can recover from exertion without remaining equally unreachable at every moment. It can respond more quickly if the environment changes. In modern clinical language, people often describe lighter sleep as a problem. In ancestral conditions, lighter sleep at the right moments may have been insurance, not perfect insurance, and certainly not free of cost, but enough to matter. A sleeper who surfaces briefly at a suspicious sound has options. A sleeper buried too deeply in uninterrupted unconsciousness may not. This does not mean that all waking is adaptive in every context. Evolution works with trade-offs, not ideals. The same biological features that improve survival under one set of conditions can become irritating or even harmful under another. The modern bedroom amplifies that mismatch. A person who wakes at 2 in the morning in a climate-controlled apartment is usually not benefiting from the vigilance that body inherited. There is no fire to tend, no predator to detect, no rival group approaching the camp. But biology is conservative. It does not rebuild itself from scratch every time culture changes. It continues to run on ancient assumptions long after the environment has been transformed. That is why a system that once made practical sense can feel, in the present, like an uninvited malfunction. The deeper structure of sleep helps explain something else as well. The body is not waiting passively for the outside world to disturb it. Internal signals are also constantly being monitored. Breathing changes, heart rate varies, hormone levels rise and fall, body temperature shifts across the night, blood sugar changes, muscles relax and sometimes twitch, sensory systems remain reduced but not absent. The brain, even while sleeping, continues to evaluate a surprising amount. Much of this work happens below awareness, but it reveals an important principle. Sleep is not the shutting down of a machine. It is the running of a different kind of watch. The organism remains occupied with maintenance, regulation, memory processing, and threshold detection. In that sense, waking during the night is not always an intrusion from outside. It can be the visible edge of an ongoing internal patrol. One lesser known and revealing detail is that brief awakenings are likely more common than people realize. Many do not remember them. The brain may rise into wakefulness for a moment, orient, and return to sleep without forming a durable memory. By morning, the night is remembered as largely continuous. This creates a distorted sense of what normal sleep has always been. People compare their remembered good nights, which may in fact contain several forgotten awakenings, to their remembered bad nights, in which one waking lasted long enough to become a story. The result is an expectation of uninterrupted sleep that may be partly built on selective recall. What feels like a dramatic break in the machinery may sometimes be the same machinery becoming briefly visible. There is also the question of energy strategy. Deep sleep is valuable. It supports physical restoration, immune function, and many aspects of brain health. But sleep that is too deep, too long, and too insensitive to change can be dangerous in exposed conditions. Evolution does not optimize for comfort in the abstract. It optimizes for surviving long enough to reproduce. If a species benefits from alternating depths, then even an imperfect night may be biologically successful. This is uncomfortable for modern sensibilities, because modern people tend to measure good sleep by subjective smoothness. Yet natural selection measures outcomes differently. A sleep system may be adaptive without being pleasant, and effective without matching what the conscious mind prefers. That helps explain why human beings are so vulnerable to the strange feeling of being abruptly awake without explanation. The explanation may simply exist at a level consciousness cannot easily inspect. Something crossed a threshold. The body's monitoring systems registered change. The sleeper surfaced. By the time thought arrives and asks why, the original trigger may already be gone or may never have been clear enough to translate into language. This creates the eerie impression of causelessness. In reality, the cause may be subtle, ancient, internal, external, or some blend of all four. Scholars still debate how much nighttime waking reflects evolved vigilance versus the ordinary mechanics of cycling through sleep stages, because no single explanation fully accounts for the phenomenon. But the two ideas are not enemies. Sleep architecture itself may be part of the evolved solution. The human brain is especially interesting here because it belongs to a species that depends heavily on learning, memory, and social coordination. Sleep is not only for physical recovery, it is tied to emotional calibration, memory consolidation, and the sorting of the day's experience into lasting patterns. That means the sleeping brain remains highly active in certain ways. Dreams emerge, emotional residues are processed, salient concerns may continue to echo beneath the surface. A creature whose survival depends not only on avoiding predators, but on navigating alliances, kinship, conflict, and resource timing benefits from a brain that keeps working at night. The cost of such complexity may be a sleep system more permeable, more dynamic, and more easily nudged into consciousness than people wish. There is an irony in this. The same species that becomes capable of building cathedrals, legal systems, irrigation networks, spacecraft, and global markets also remains vulnerable to being lifted out of sleep by a nearly untraceable shift in the room. Intelligence does not abolish old thresholds. It adds new burdens to them. The brain that evolved to sample the night for danger eventually learns to sample it for deadlines, losses, social embarrassments, unfinished obligations, and imagined futures. But before those modern contents fill the waking moment, the original biological movement is often simpler. First the organism surfaces, then the human being interprets. This distinction matters because it softens the false boundary between normal and broken sleep. Human sleep was likely never a perfectly sealed chamber. It was more like a tide, moving through recurrent states, sometimes retreating enough to expose awareness before rising again. A species sleeping in dangerous and changing environments could hardly afford a design that required absolute sensory indifference for 8 uninterrupted hours. The evidence remains indirect, but the logic is strong. Cyclical sleep with built-in permeability is precisely the kind of compromise one would expect in a creature that must recover without vanishing. The body's timing systems also reinforce this flexible design. Across the night, certain hours are naturally associated with different depths and vulnerabilities. Before dawn, temperature is low, hormone patterns shift, and sleep often becomes lighter. This is a biologically sensitive period even now. In ancestral settings, it may have been particularly important. Fires dim, cold intensifies, predators and scavengers still move. Human groups preparing to travel or rise with early light begin nearing the end of their deepest rest. A sleep system that becomes easier to interrupt at certain points may have aligned well with those realities. Modern people often notice these awakenings most in the small hours and assume something has gone mysteriously wrong. It may be that they are brushing against one of the oldest built-in rhythms of the species. None of this guarantees that every nighttime awakening is good, beneficial, or harmless. Chronic sleep fragmentation can be miserable. Severe disruptions can damage mood, health, and cognition. The point is not to romanticize poor sleep. The point is to understand that the human sleep system emerges from evolutionary compromise, not from a promise of flawless continuity. Waking at night can be caused by stress, illness, breathing problems, hormones, temperature, or habit. But beneath all these immediate causes lies a deeper fact: the brain is designed to sleep in cycles, and those cycles leave room for waking. So the person lying in darkness at 3:11 in the morning may not be experiencing a betrayal by the body so much as a glimpse of its underlying design. The modern world teaches people to expect a smooth blackout. Biology offers something older and more conditional. It offers descent, return, depth, lightness, and intermittent surveillance. It offers a form of rest that evolved under pressure and still carries the shape of that pressure within it. Humans wake at night in part because their brains were never built to sink beyond retrieval for the entire duration of darkness. They were built to rest, yes, but also to remain recoverable to the world. And once that possibility is accepted, another question follows naturally. If the architecture of sleep preserves a capacity for brief vigilance, then what exactly has been passed down through generations of uncertain nights? Not conscious memory, but something more durable than memory: a tendency, a bias, a readiness. The body may be carrying forward not merely a pattern of sleep stages, but the long inheritance of ancestors who survived because some part of them remained, even in darkness. Prepare to listen. What passes from one generation to the next is rarely a memory in the ordinary sense. No one inherits a scene. No one is born carrying an image of a firelit camp, a distant animal cry, a storm crossing open country, or the sound of strangers moving beyond the edge of sleep. Those vanish with the individuals who lived them. What can endure is something less visible and more powerful: a tendency in the nervous system, a bias in attention, a threshold set a little lower for certain kinds of signals, a body prepared to treat the night as meaningful even when the conscious mind insists that nothing is wrong. This is the memory of ancestors in its most biological form, not a recollection, but a design. Human beings often prefer inheritance to look clean and simple. They imagine genes delivering obvious traits: eye color, height, a certain shape of hand, while the subtler structures of feeling and readiness seem too personal, too psychological, or too modern to belong to deep time. But selection does not care much about those distinctions. If some patterns of arousal, vigilance, and recovery consistently help organisms survive and reproduce, then over long periods those patterns can become more common. The result is not destiny. It is not a rigid script. It is a set of probabilities, an architecture of response that makes some reactions easier to trigger than others. Night waking may belong partly to that architecture. This possibility becomes more persuasive when one remembers how long humans and their ancestors live under conditions where vigilance matters. Not for a century or two, but across immense expanses of evolutionary time. For generation after generation, sleep happens under pressure, and the individuals who wake quickly enough, lightly enough, or often enough in the right moments may preserve more of themselves and their children. That does not mean waking is always rewarded. Too much arousal is costly, panic is costly, exhaustion is costly. Evolution is sorting not for constant fear, but for systems that can tilt toward alertness without destroying the capacity to rest. The balancing act itself becomes inherited. There is a dry cruelty in that balance. The same nervous system that once gave an ancestral group a better chance of surviving the dark may now leave a modern person staring at a familiar ceiling, irritated by their own pulse. The trait survives because the world that shaped it lasted so long, and the world that made it inconvenient arrived comparatively late. Civilization changes quickly. Nervous systems do not. Walls go up faster than thresholds come down. A body can be born into safety and still behave as though safety remains partial, because in the timescale that built the species, safety was almost always partial. The evidence for such inherited readiness is necessarily indirect. One cannot dig up a prehistoric genome and read from it a line that says wake at 2:43 in the morning when the room is too quiet. Scholars still debate how far one can push adaptive explanations of human behavior, and they are right to be cautious. The evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for why people wake at night, and not every feature of sleep must be treated as a finely tuned survival strategy. Some patterns arise from constraints, side effects, or general biological organization rather than direct selection. Even so, there is strong case that human beings inherit not only a need for sleep, but a particular style of sleep shaped by long exposure to uncertainty. That inherited style may involve more than simple responsiveness to external threat. It may also include a predisposition for social vigilance. Humans survive not only by noticing predators, but by remaining sensitive to the emotional and behavioral state of others. A sleeping child stirs, a partner shifts, a group member returns late. A baby's change in breathing matters. A subtle cry can pull adults toward wakefulness with astonishing speed. In a deeply social species, the night is not monitored only for attack, it is monitored for kin. This may be one reason why many modern awakenings feel strangely interpersonal, even when no one is there. The body is not just checking the environment in the abstract, it is checking the human world nearest to it. This kind of inheritance is easy to overlook because modern individualism distorts the older setting. Today, many people sleep alone or in carefully bounded households. For most of human existence, that is not the rule. The sleeping mind develops amid layered social dependence. Safety comes from proximity, but so does responsibility. Someone must hear the infant. Someone must notice the embers dying. Someone must respond if another person becomes ill, distressed, or missing. It is not hard to imagine selection favoring nervous systems that remain, even in sleep, somewhat available to the needs of others. The cost is lighter sleep. The benefit is group resilience. There may also be a more intimate inheritance, one shaped not only by deep evolution, but by the immediate conditions passed from parents to children. Human development is unusually long and unusually sensitive to the environment. Infants and children grow within emotional climates as well as physical ones. If sleep in early life occurs amid instability, conflict, fear, irregularity, or constant alertness, the nervous system may become calibrated toward easier waking. This is not ancient evolution in the strictest sense, but it still belongs to the larger story of inheritance. The body does not simply receive a blank ancestral template and leave it untouched. It tunes that template in response to lived conditions. Some of the watchfulness in the night may be species old. Some may be family shaped. Some may be both at once. One lesser-known detail from modern research into arousal systems is how powerfully expectation and conditioning can alter what wakes a sleeper. Human beings do not respond equally to all sounds. They remain especially sensitive to signals that have acquired meaning. A baby's cry, a certain voice, an unusual silence, an anticipated alarm. This selectivity suggests that the sleeping brain is not merely guarding against random disturbances, it is maintaining a hierarchy of importance. In ancestral settings, such selectivity would be advantageous. Not every rustle deserves waking. Some do. The brain that can sort, however imperfectly, between background and significance gains an edge. That sorting mechanism may linger now in peculiar ways, pulling people awake for reasons that are real to the organism but inaccessible to easy introspection. This is where the notion of a watchful lineage becomes useful, provided it is handled carefully. It should not be turned into mysticism or into a sentimental story about primal wisdom. The body is not sacred in that sense. It is practical, messy, and often inconvenient. But it is also layered with solutions assembled over time. A tendency to wake at night may be one of those solutions, preserved not because it feels good, but because under many circumstances it was good enough. The fact that it can now feel misplaced does not erase the long history that made it possible. There is a larger human pattern here as well. Many aspects of modern discomfort arise because ancient adaptations are operating in altered environments. Taste systems shaped by scarcity encounter abundance. Stress responses shaped by immediate danger encounter abstract anxiety. Social instincts built for small groups encounter mass society and permanent comparison. Sleep belongs to this same category of mismatch. A brain that evolved to remain somewhat interruptible through the night now lives amid electric light, psychological strain, and the expectation of perfect rest. The result is confusion. People assume the body is defective when, in many cases, it may simply be old. That age does not make it wise. It does not mean every nighttime awakening should be accepted without concern. Modern medicine is right to take sleep problems seriously. Breathing disorders, chronic stress, depression, hormonal changes, pain, medications, and environmental disturbances can all turn ordinary vigilance into damaging fragmentation. The point is more unsettling than comforting. Sometimes nothing is broken at all. Sometimes the person waking in darkness is experiencing an ancient capacity that no longer fits neatly inside the cultural dream of uninterrupted sleep. The body is not failing to become modern enough. It is refusing, in one small way, to forget what shaped it. The emotional force of this refusal can be surprisingly strong. When people wake in the night, they often do not merely notice wakefulness. They notice an atmosphere. The room feels different than it does by day. Thoughts become heavier, minor concerns enlarge, time itself seems altered. Part of that is certainly due to chemistry and fatigue, but part may also reflect the old significance of the hour. Darkness once mattered in ways daylight did not. It narrowed vision, increased uncertainty, magnified consequence. The nervous system still seems to know this before the intellect can explain it. The night carries weight, and the waking body rises to meet that weight with inherited seriousness. Over generations. Then, humans may have passed along more than the need to sleep. They may have passed along a style of caution woven into sleep, a readiness to surface, to sample, to listen before fully understanding. This is not the dramatic fear of myths and monsters, though those would come later and attach themselves naturally to darkness. It is more elemental than that. It is the simple evolutionary truth that creatures who cannot afford total surrender learn to rest without giving themselves away entirely. And yet the story is not only about fear, it is also about adaptation, cooperation, and the subtle intelligence of partial wakefulness. Human beings survive not because they conquer vulnerability, but because they learn to live inside it. They sleep near one another. They make fire. They build shelter. They wake briefly and return to rest. Over time, that pattern becomes ordinary enough to vanish into the species. It becomes one more inherited rhythm, carried forward without conscious permission. So when a modern sleeper opens their eyes at an unreasonable hour and listens to a silent room, they may be hearing more than the present. They may be encountering a nervous system shaped by ancestors who rarely had the luxury of assuming the night was empty. That assumption, more than the waking itself, may be the recent invention. The body still behaves as though darkness deserves checking, and for an immense span of human history, it did. But darkness itself changes as humans begin to change it. The old night is not left untouched forever. Fire grows more reliable, shelters improve, sleeping becomes more social, more structured, more protected. The world that once required constant vigilance is modified by human hands, though never completely tamed. And with that change comes a new question. If ancient humans learned to push back the night with flame, warmth, and shared space, why does waking still remain with us even after the darkness begins to soften? Fire changes everything, but it does not change everything equally. It extends the day, hardens tools, reshapes food, alters landscapes, gathers bodies into a circle, and gives human beings one of their first reliable ways to hold back the dark. Few technologies in human history are as transformative or as ancient, and yet the strange persistence of night waking suggests that fire solves only part of the problem. It pushes danger outward. It does not erase the need to listen. It creates shelter in a hostile world, but it also creates new patterns of dependence, new social dynamics, and new reasons for sleep to remain light at the edges. To imagine the human night before and after fire is to imagine two different kinds of darkness. Without controlled flame, night belongs almost entirely to the world beyond human intention. With flame, humans begin to carve out a temporary interior within that world. Light flickers on faces, tools, walls, hands, sleeping children. Predators may hesitate at the edge of illumination. Insects may be reduced. Warmth pools where cold would otherwise gather. Food can be cooked more safely. Smoke may keep some threats away. A campfire is not merely practical, it is spatial. It invents a center. Around that center, people can sleep in ways that are more coordinated, more protected, and more deeply social than before. This matters because human sleep does not evolve in isolation from human technology. Once fire becomes a recurring feature of life, it begins altering the conditions under which rest is possible. A body sleeping near warmth need not spend as much energy fighting cold. A group sleeping around a hearth can distribute vigilance more effectively. Late evening activity becomes possible in new ways: storytelling, tool repair, social bonding, ritual, and simple companionship all lengthen into hours that darkness once suppressed. Scholars still debate the exact timeline and intensity of these changes, because the evidence remains uneven across regions and periods. But no serious account of human sleep can ignore the role of fire. It makes night more livable, and therefore makes human sleep more communal and more structured. Yet this new protection is imperfect from the beginning. Fire is labor. It must be fed, preserved, shielded, and sometimes rekindled at cost. A hearth can fail in the night. Embers can thin. Wind can change direction. Rain can interfere. Smoke can become overwhelming in enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces. Sparks can drift where they should not. A flame too small offers little security. A flame too large threatens the shelter itself. This is the paradox of one of humanity's greatest inventions. Fire makes sleep safer, but it also becomes one more thing that cannot be entirely ignored. Someone notices when the warmth fades. Someone wakes when smoke thickens. Someone rises to add fuel. Protection itself creates obligations. This may help explain why human sleep remains responsive even as shelter improves. The problem is not only external threat now, it is the maintenance of the human-made buffer between the group and the dark. A dying fire matters. So does a shifting wind, a cracked enclosure, or a child kicking free of coverings in cold air. The waking body no longer listens only for predators or strangers. It listens for failures in the fragile system that keeps danger at a distance. A person waking in the night because the room feels different may be experiencing a very old pattern indeed, one sharpened not only by fear of what lies beyond the camp, but by sensitivity to what has changed within it. Shared sleeping spaces intensify this effect. Fire tends to gather people together, and gathered people alter one another's sleep. The sleeping circle or clustered shelter offers security through numbers, warmth through proximity, and richer social cohesion. But it also guarantees disturbance. Bodies shift, someone coughs, an infant stirs, another sleeper mutters or rises. The air changes as the fire changes. One lesser known but intriguing possibility raised by anthropological observation is that human groups may benefit from naturally staggered sleep without planning it consciously. Differences in age, temperament, exhaustion, illness, and biological timing can produce a loose pattern in which some individuals are more alert while others are deeper asleep. In practical terms, this means the group remains never fully unconscious at once. No single explanation fully accounts for how universal this would have been, but as a broad principle it fits human life remarkably well. That kind of arrangement has consequences for the nervous system. If the group is the unit that survives, then sleep does not need to be equally deep in every individual at every moment. It only needs to be good enough across the collective. This is a subtle but important shift in how human sleep can be understood. People often think of sleep as a private biological task. In much of human history, it is partly a social function. Individuals rest within a web of shared protection, shared inconvenience, and shared alertness. Under those conditions, occasional waking is not necessarily a sign that the system has failed. It may be one of the ways the system works. Fire also changes the symbolic meaning of darkness. Once a flame can be sustained, night is no longer a single undivided condition. There is an illuminated interior and a surrounding exterior. There is known and unknown, warmth and cold, familiarity and what waits beyond the edge of sight. This distinction may deepen the body's sensitivity rather than remove it. The campfire does not abolish the dark, it dramatizes it. Everything beyond the circle remains obscure. Sounds from outside the light may feel even more charged because the human eye has adjusted to the immediate zone of brightness. A snapping branch beyond the firelight is no longer merely a sound in darkness. It is an interruption from the unseen outside. Sleep near fire may therefore be safer, but also psychologically more selective, more tuned to the boundary between inside and beyond. Shelters develop along similar lines. Branch structures, hide tents, windbreaks, huts, and more durable dwellings gradually reduce exposure. They block some noise, conserve some heat, and narrow the directions from which danger can arrive. But they do not produce modern insulation. They creak, leak, smoke, trap odours, and transmit movement. In many cases they make sleepers more aware of internal conditions even as they reduce exposure to external ones. A slight change in air can become more noticeable in a confined structure. The absence of a familiar sound can be as meaningful as the presence of a new one. A protective environment is still an environment with thresholds, and the human body remains exquisitely skilled at detecting threshold changes. There is another layer to this transformation. Fire likely alters circadian behavior, pushing human wakefulness later into the evening than sunset alone would dictate. Once social life extends deeper into darkness, the transition into sleep becomes less immediate and more culturally shaped. People can talk longer, work longer, bond longer, plan longer. The mind goes to sleep carrying more of the group's emotional and practical content. This does not make night waking inevitable, but it does suggest that human sleep is becoming increasingly entangled with social cognition. Rest is no longer simply the body collapsing after daylight labour. It is preceded by prolonged collective time, which may enrich memory, reinforce bonds, and also leave the nervous system carrying more unfinished signals into the night. This is one reason waking does not disappear as human protection improves. Better shelter and fire reduce certain risks, but they also create more complex nights. The dark becomes socially inhabited. A person may wake not because the wilderness is intruding, but because the human sphere itself is active, fragile, and meaningful. The infant's cry matters, the elder's breathing matters, the fire's condition matters, the proximity of others matters. Ancient vigilance becomes less solitary and more relational. The body does not abandon its habit of checking, it simply acquires more things worth checking. Modern people often imagine progress as a steady narrowing of uncertainty. In many ways that is true. Fire, shelter, and community make the night vastly more survivable. Yet progress also layers new systems atop old bodies. It does not wipe the body clean. A human being who has spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving around conditional protection may not stop waking simply because protection improves. The waking may become shorter, more selective, less often tied to raw fear, but it remains. The organism still samples its environment because that sampling has long been part of how humans get through the night. There is something revealing in the fact that many modern awakenings still begin with listening. Even in rooms where no fire needs tending and no wind enters through hide walls, the body often returns to consciousness by checking first and interpreting second. That sequence feels older than civilization because, in a sense, it is. Fire modifies the human night by giving people their first durable defense against darkness, but it also teaches the body to monitor the defense itself. Waking survives because the human project remains unfinished. Safety is built, maintained, adjusted, and never fully complete. And so the night becomes stranger, not simpler. The invention that softens darkness also teaches people to live more richly inside it. They gather later, sleep closer, depend more on one another, and rest within systems that can falter. The old fear of what is outside does not vanish. It is joined by the need to notice what is changing inside the ring of protection. Human sleep becomes warmer, more communal, and more buffered than before, but still not seamless. It remains a bargain between surrender and surveillance. That bargain would continue even after shelters become homes and camps become villages. In fact, later historical societies would preserve a revealing clue that the modern world has nearly forgotten. Many people do not expect sleep to be one smooth block at all. They expect the night to contain a pause, a waking interval so common that it scarcely needs explanation. Fire helps create the conditions for that older rhythm to flourish, but history would leave the clearer record. And in that record lies one of the most surprising facts of all. For a very long time, waking in the middle of the night may not have been considered strange in the slightest. For most people now, waking in the middle of the night feels like an interruption. It carries the emotional tone of a mistake, a break in the proper sequence, something to be corrected or endured. Yet history preserves a faint and remarkably stubborn clue that this modern reaction may be far newer than the waking itself. In the pre-industrial world, and likely in many places for far longer, sleep does not always appear as one sealed block. It often seems to come in two movements, divided by a period of quiet wakefulness so ordinary that people barely bother to explain it. The old night has room inside it, and that room is not always feared. The idea is simple, but its implications are enormous. For centuries, in parts of Europe and likely elsewhere in forms the written record only partially captures, people speak of a first sleep and a second sleep. These are not poetic inventions. They appear in diaries, court records, medical texts, devotional writing, and casual references that suggest familiarity rather than novelty. A person goes to bed, sleeps for some hours, wakes in the middle of the night, remains awake for a while, then returns to bed for the second stretch. The waking is not automatically an emergency. It can be a period for prayer, conversation, thought, sex, tending the fire, checking animals, or simply lying quietly. What startles the modern reader is not only that the pattern exists, but that it is treated as normal enough to pass without explanation. This historical clue matters because it weakens one of the most powerful modern assumptions, the belief that truly natural human sleep should be continuous from bedtime to dawn. Once that assumption loosens, night waking begins to look less like a universal disorder and more like a pattern whose meaning depends on culture, environment, and expectation. Scholars still debate how widespread segmented sleep truly is, how strongly it varies by class and season, and how far one can generalize from surviving written records, which naturally favor literate societies and particular kinds of people. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the records suggests with surprising force that middle-of-the-night waking is not merely a private defect invented by modern stress. It has history behind it. The timing itself makes practical sense. In a world with limited artificial light, people often spend longer hours in darkness than modern populations do. Winter nights especially can be long enough that one continuous block of sleep may not fill them comfortably or biologically. If people go to bed not long after dusk, they may naturally wake after several hours, remain quietly alert for a period, then sleep again before dawn. This rhythm does not require pathology. It only requires a life more closely aligned with seasonal darkness than most modern lives allow. When researchers in more recent times expose people to longer natural nights without electric light, something similar can emerge: an initial sleep, a waking interval, and a second descent into rest. No single explanation fully accounts for all historical cases, but the pattern is suggestive. What is especially revealing is the mood attached to this waking interval. It is often described not as frantic but as calm, even contemplative. The world is quiet. The labor of the day is suspended. The body has already taken some rest and has not yet fully entered the demands of dawn. In that suspended middle, consciousness can feel unusually clear. There is less pressure to force sleep immediately because the waking itself is not interpreted as failure. This difference in interpretation may matter more than modern sleepers realize. A body that wakes briefly and is met with acceptance may drift back to rest more easily than one met instantly by dread, clock-checking, and self-accusation. This is not to romanticize pre-industrial nights. Many are cold, noisy, crowded, and physically uncomfortable. Illness, childbirth, labour schedules, bed sharing, lice, mice, drafts, and anxiety about survival can make sleep deeply imperfect. But imperfection is precisely the point. Historical people do not always construct one idealized standard and judge themselves against it. They live within patterns that modern societies later compress or erase. If waking between two sleeps is common, then the human relationship with the night may once have been more spacious than it is now, less dominated by the demand for total unconsciousness and more accommodating of intervals. That accommodation may go back far beyond the specific phrase first sleep and second sleep. Written records capture only the late and visible surface of older habits. The deeper roots may extend into the long human experience of flexible, socially embedded, environmentally responsive sleep. Firelit camps, clustered households, village nights, and agrarian rhythms all prepare the ground for sleep that need not behave like a modern industrial ideal. The historical sources do not prove that prehistoric humans follow exactly the same segmented pattern, but they do make one thing harder to deny: people are fully capable of treating middle-of-the-night waking as ordinary when culture allows them to do so. One lesser-known aspect of this old waking interval is how useful it may have felt. Some medical and religious writings treat the period between sleeps as especially suited to reflection or prayer. In other contexts, it becomes a quiet time for intimacy or for dealing with practical tasks that do not require daylight. The fact that this interval can be used at all suggests that the waking mind is not always confused or distressed. It may be calm, lucid, and still partly cushioned by the first phase of rest. That calmness is important. It hints that the suffering attached to night waking is not produced only by the waking itself, but by the meaning later societies attach to it. The modern world steadily strips away the conditions that make segmented sleep easy to notice. Artificial lighting lengthens evenings, work schedules tighten mornings, urban noise alters the quality of the night, household routines become more rigid, privacy increases, but so does isolation. People begin going to bed later relative to sunset while still rising at fixed times. Under those conditions, the old space between sleeps is squeezed. The body may still try to wake, but the culture surrounding it now treats that waking as an obstacle. What might once have been a familiar pause becomes, in a different social system, a problem to solve. This transformation may explain why many people experience night waking with such immediate alarm. They're not merely awake. They're awake inside a framework that insists they should not be. They know the clock is running. They imagine tomorrow already damaged. They begin managing themselves at once, trying to push consciousness back down by force. In that sense, the modern distress around waking may be partly historical rather than purely biological. The nervous system does something old. The culture interprets it in a new and punishing way. It is also possible that the old pattern was never universal even in the past. Climate, labour demands, household structure, health, and local customs all likely mattered. Some people surely slept heavily when exhausted. Others likely remained fragmented by babies, pain, cold, or fear. Historical sleep is not one thing. What matters is not proving that every ancestor had 2 sleeps, but recognizing that continuous sleep was not the only accepted human model. Once that recognition is in place, the modern experience of waking in darkness becomes less lonely and less absolute. It belongs to a broader range of human nights than the modern imagination usually admits. There is something almost archaeological about this realization. Beneath the polished floor of modern sleep culture lies an older structure, partly buried but still intact in places. People once named the night in two parts. They organized expectation around interruption. They lived close enough to darkness to know that consciousness need not vanish for the entire duration of it. The terms have faded, but the body may not have forgotten the rhythm they describe. A person waking after several hours of sleep may be doing something the species has done for a very long time, even if the room around them no longer knows how to interpret it. The history of first and second sleep also reveals how flexible human norms can be. What one era treats as common sense, another treats as disorder. What one household accepts, another medicalizes. The line between natural and abnormal is often drawn not only by biology, but by schedules, technology, and social values. This does not mean all sleep complaints are imaginary. Chronic or distressing waking can be serious and deserves attention. It means only that some part of the suffering may arise from mismatch, from an ancient rhythm pressing upward inside a culture that has narrowed the acceptable form of rest. So the midnight waking, far from being a purely modern mystery, may be a surviving remnant of an older organization of the night. The body rises, not necessarily because something is wrong, but because the human night has long been structured with pauses, checks, and returns. The first sleep loosens. Consciousness enters the room. For a time, the person is neither fully in the day nor fully surrendered to darkness. Then, if conditions allow, the second sleep arrives. But history does not hold still. As villages become towns, and towns become more regulated, sleep is subjected to new pressures. Bells mark time. Labour becomes more disciplined. Streets grow louder. Social hierarchies tighten. Night remains dark. But it is no longer simply the old natural darkness punctuated by hearths and stars. Human beings begin reorganizing it more aggressively, and in doing so they alter the meaning of waking yet again. The old segmented rhythm survives in traces. But another force is coming into the bedroom now, the growing power of civilization to tell bodies when, how, and for how long they should sleep. As human settlements thicken, sleep becomes less a private negotiation with darkness, and more a condition shaped by systems outside the sleeper's control. The village does not simply gather more people into one place, it gathers animals, tools, property, obligation, hierarchy, and noise. It produces regularity, but also interference. A person living in a camp may be woken by weather, embers, or movement at the edge of visibility. A person living in a village or town acquires additional reasons to wake, many of them distinctly human. Doors open, animals shift in pens, neighbours argue, wheels grind over rough ground, bells mark hours, prayers, warnings, labour, curfew, fire, death. The night remains dark, but it is no longer only natural darkness. It has become civic. This is one of the great turning points in the human relationship with sleep. Agriculture ties people more firmly to place. Permanent structures improve protection. Stored food alters risk, and communities gain new layers of order. At the same time, fixed settlement means fixed disturbance. Human beings cluster in ways their ancestors rarely did. Smoke accumulates more persistently. Parasites spread more easily. Domestic animals introduce sounds, smells, and interruptions into the sleeping environment. A rooster does not care whether the sleeper needs another hour. A barking dog, a distressed goat, a restless horse, or vermin in the walls all belong to the new acoustics of settled life. The body still does what it always did, sampling the night for change. But now much of the change comes from civilization itself. The rise of scheduled labour deepens the transformation. Once communities depend on fields, irrigation, taxation, transport, markets, and coordinated tasks, sleep increasingly sits under external demands. Dawn matters in a sharper way. Seasonal rhythms remain powerful, but social rhythms begin tightening around them. The body may still carry older patterns, including the possibility of waking between sleeps, yet the acceptable margins grow narrower when morning work is obligatory and communal. A farmer cannot always treat the middle of the night as contemplative if sunrise brings labour that cannot be postponed. This does not eliminate old sleep patterns, but it places them under pressure. What once fit the structure of darkness may begin to conflict with the structure of work. Urban life intensifies this even further. The early city is not a machine of silence. It is dense, dirty, layered, and audibly alive. People live close together, often without strong separation between household or workshop, storage, and street. Night watchmen pass. Late arrivals knock. Drunk voices carry. Animals remain everywhere. In wealthier homes, servants move at odd hours. In poorer ones, whole families share cramped sleeping spaces where privacy is scarce and disturbance inevitable. Even in times before modern industry, the city trains the nervous system to remain alert in new ways. The threat is no longer only the wilderness beyond the firelight, it is theft, fire, disease, crowding, authority, and the constant fact of other human beings sleeping uneasily nearby. Fire, once a source of protection, also becomes a source of civic danger in settled life. A single unattended flame can destroy homes, storehouses, and streets. In dense towns, the sleeping body may be surrounded by structures more combustible than protective. This gives new meaning to waking in the night. A strange smell, an unusual shout, or the ring of a bell can matter immediately. Many communities build systems precisely because the night remains dangerous even under civilization. Watch patrols, curfews, night bells, and communal responses to fire all testify to a stubborn truth. Human beings have not escaped the old uncertainty. They have reorganized it into social form. This is where the pressure of authority enters sleep. Timekeeping becomes more explicit. Religious observance may divide the night with prayer hours. Monastic communities structure darkness with intention, rising at prescribed times. Later, civic and commercial life become even more clock-bound. The sleeper is no longer guided only by sunset, temperature, and bodily need. He or she is gradually recruited into larger temporal systems. Bells do not merely inform, they discipline. They tell populations when to work, worship, close gates, mark curfew, or respond to emergency. Under such conditions, waking at night can no longer be understood only as biological vigilance. It also becomes a response to social time, to being embedded in a world where the community claims part of the night. One lesser-known consequence of this shift is that sleep starts to reflect status more visibly. The wealthy can sometimes buy quieter rooms, thicker walls, private chambers, and softer bedding. The poor cannot. In crowded households and dense quarters, sleep remains exposed to every communal imperfection. Noise, cold, smell, and interruption become unequally distributed. This matters because later cultural ideas about proper sleep often emerge from narrower social groups whose conditions are not universal. The ideal of smooth, orderly rest is easier to imagine when one has greater control over one's sleeping environment. For many others across history, waking at night remains so ordinary that the very expectation of uninterrupted sleep would seem almost luxurious. Yet even luxury does not solve everything. The body brought into the house is still the same old body shaped by deep time. Thick walls reduce some disturbances, but not internal ones. A sleeper may still rise toward awareness because of temperature change, shifting hormones, bodily discomfort, dreams, grief, or the faintest suggestion that something in the environment has altered. Civilization narrows the field of danger, but it also expands the field of anxiety. Property can be stolen. Debts can come due. Social reputation can collapse. Political violence can erupt in streets rather than grasslands. The object of vigilance changes, but vigilance itself survives. This is one of the darker ironies of settled life. As societies become more organized, the night becomes less physically wild yet more psychologically charged. The wilderness outside the camp is replaced, in part, by the social wilderness inside civilization. A person may no longer need to fear a leopard in the doorway, but may fear a creditor, a knock at the gate, an infant with fever, a neighboring fire, tomorrow's harvest, tomorrow's rent, or the authority of church, lord, or state. The nervous system that once monitored for predators and storms now has ample new material. Fear moves from landscape into structure. It becomes domestic, legal, financial, moral. This does not mean people in earlier settled societies are chronically sleepless in the modern sense. It means sleep is always being negotiated with the conditions of the age. In some periods, segmented sleep may still fit comfortably within long nights. In others, social demands compress rest into tighter forms. In all of them, waking persists as part of the human repertoire. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the experiences of ordinary people whose nights rarely enter written records in detail. But enough survives to suggest continuity beneath change. Human beings keep building more ordered worlds, and still their nights remain punctuated. The bells are especially symbolic here. They represent one of the first large-scale efforts to organize time outside the body. Before clocks become personal, bells make time public. They carry across darkness, overriding individual rhythms with communal signal. The sleeper who wakes at a distant bell is waking not only because of sound, but because civilization has learned to penetrate the night. This has consequences that go far beyond noise. It teaches populations to think of sleep as something that must fit official time. Once that lesson takes hold, waking in the wrong place within the night begins to feel less neutral. The body is no longer simply relating to darkness, it is relating to schedule. And schedule always carries judgment. A waking that once might have been accepted as part of the night can start to feel like inefficiency, weakness, waste, or disorder, if morning duties are rigid enough. This shift sets the stage for a modern misunderstanding that will only grow stronger in later centuries. When societies become more disciplined about labour and time, they do not merely change sleep habits, they change sleep morality. Good sleep becomes sleep that supports productivity. Bad sleep becomes sleep that fails to do so. In that framework, every interruption starts to look suspicious. Still, the older patterns do not vanish on command. People continue to wake in the dark. They continue listening first, thinking later. They continue living in bodies older than the clocks that govern them. The city may narrow the stars overhead, the bell may divide the hours, and the field may demand the dawn, but the organism remains built for a more conditional kind of night. That is why settled life does not abolish waking. It multiplies its meanings. A person may wake because the street is loud, because the child coughs, because the body is cycling upward through lighter sleep, because tomorrow's labour is already present in the mind, or because some ancient threshold has been crossed for reasons too subtle to name. By now the story is no longer just about darkness or danger. It is about the layering of worlds inside one species. The prehistoric night taught humans not to surrender completely. Fire taught them to monitor the fragile barrier between safety and exposure. History taught them that sleep could come in phases. Settled civilization adds another instruction. The night belongs partly to institutions, to labor, to clocks, to collective order. The sleeper lies at the intersection of all these inheritances at once. And from that intersection comes a transformation even more intimate than noise or bells. External danger, once dominant, begins slipping inward. The same body that wakes for a sound beyond the wall can now wake for an unpaid debt, a remembered humiliation, a grief not fully spoken in daylight. Civilization does not merely crowd the night, it teaches the mind to occupy it. The next shift in the story is quieter, but perhaps more important than all the rest. Fear, after long ages of living outside us, learns to make a home indoors. Once fear moves indoors, night waking changes its character without entirely changing its origin. The body still rises toward awareness as it always has, quickly, efficiently, before the conscious mind has gathered its language. But what it finds waiting there is no longer only weather, predators, strangers, or civic disturbance. It finds thought, it finds memory, it finds anticipation. The old architecture of vigilance remains, yet the object of vigilance begins to migrate inward, where it can no longer be checked by glancing at the edge of the firelight or listening for footsteps beyond the wall. The modern sleeper can wake into a room that is physically safe and still feel surrounded by danger. Because the danger now arrives in abstractions the nervous system is not especially well equipped to dismiss. This is one of the most consequential changes in the long history of the night. Human beings do not simply inherit the capacity to wake, they also become the kind of creatures who carry unfinished experience into sleep, a social species with long memory, future planning, moral anxiety, grief, attachment, and language cannot keep the day neatly sealed away once the eyes close. The brain continues sorting, anticipating, and reacting. Loss remains active. Shame remains active. Obligation remains active. The same body that once woke because the darkness contained possible teeth now wakes because tomorrow contains possible failure. There is nothing imaginary about this shift. Internalized fear is not weaker than external danger simply because it has no visible form. In many cases it is more persistent. A predator either appears or it does not. A storm either crosses the camp or passes elsewhere. But grief can remain for years. Debt can remain. Social humiliation can remain. A sick child may sleep in the next room for months of uncertainty. Political violence may not be at the door tonight, but it may live in the body as expectation. The nervous system, shaped to respond quickly to threat, does not always distinguish well between immediate physical danger and lingering psychological load. Both can raise arousal. Both can lower the threshold for waking. Both can leave the sleeper surfaced in darkness before reason has had time to explain why. This may be why nighttime consciousness often feels uniquely heavy. During the day, the mind is buffered by activity, movement, conversation, tasks, noise, and light help distribute attention. At night, especially after abrupt waking, the mind meets its own contents in a stripped environment. Fatigue weakens perspective. The room is quiet. Time feels exposed. Thoughts that would seem manageable in daylight can become absolute in darkness. This is not merely a poetic impression. The sleeping brain has shifted chemistry, temperature, and rhythm. Judgment is altered. emotional material can feel larger and more final. A waking that begins as an ordinary physiological surfacing can, within minutes, become an encounter with dread. One lesser-known aspect of this process is how selective the sleeping brain can be about what it treats as important. Human beings do not wake equally for every internal concern. The brain seems to privilege unresolved, emotionally charged, or biologically salient material. Parents can sleep through traffic and wake to a child's faint cry. A person awaiting bad news may wake before an alarm, sometimes repeatedly, as though the body has set a vigil around the anticipated event. People under chronic stress often wake at similar hours night after night, suggesting not a random glitch but a patterned relationship between arousal and expectation. Scholars still debate exactly how these mechanisms interact, and no single explanation fully accounts for every case. But the broader pattern is clear enough. Meaning wakes us. This is where the old and new stories converge most sharply. The body evolved to monitor significance in the dark. Once significance begins to include social, emotional, and symbolic threats, the same monitoring system can be recruited into much stranger territory. The sleeper no longer needs a predator outside. The mind itself becomes a landscape full of uncertain signals. Did I forget something vital? Is someone I love in danger? What if that pain means something serious? What happens tomorrow if I fail? Why did I say that? Why did they say that? These are not the thoughts of a prehistoric camp, but they are delivered through a system built for urgent checking. Night waking becomes the meeting point between ancient vigilance and modern self-awareness. The home, for all its safety, intensifies this in particular ways. A house gathers personal meaning. It contains the people one fears losing, the objects tied to work and debt, the rooms where illness is noticed, the silence in which absence becomes real. External danger may be reduced, but the emotional stakes of the interior become immense. A creak in the house can wake older layers of alertness. So can the absence of a familiar sound. Anyone who has lived with an infant, an elderly parent, a sick partner, or a troubled household knows how quickly sleep becomes conditional under such circumstances. The body learns, it sleeps, but never entirely without one ear turned toward responsibility. This may be one reason anxiety so often takes nocturnal form. During the day, anxious systems are dispersed across many channels of input. At night, those channels narrow. The organism is still cycling through states of lighter and deeper sleep, still capable of surfacing. But when it surfaces, there is little in the environment to compete with internal signal. The result can feel like being ambushed by one's own mind. In truth, the process may be less dramatic and more mechanical. A light sleep phase arrives, a pulse of stress hormone, a change in breathing, a remembered concern, or an anticipated obligation crosses threshold. The body wakes, then thought, always eager for narrative, begins building a case for catastrophe. Human beings are particularly vulnerable to this because they are temporal creatures. They do not merely experience the present, they live inside remembered pasts and imagined futures. The nervous system, however, remains more primitive in its core operations. It responds to arousal as arousal. It does not always care whether the threat is currently in the room or only represented in thought. This mismatch can make the night cruel. A person can wake because of tomorrow. The body mobilizes now. Although the event itself is abstract, deferred, or uncertain, from the point of view of deep evolutionary time, this is a relatively new burden placed on an old alarm system. There is also a social inheritance here. Many cultures teach children, sometimes subtly, that the night is when worries become serious, when hidden things emerge, when illness worsens, when death visits, when spirits roam, when bad news arrives, when the mind should be afraid of what it cannot check. Even in secular modern life, these emotional codes linger. Night is not merely darker than day. It is symbolically charged. The body, already inclined to wake and assess, wakes into a cultural atmosphere that tells it darkness matters. This does not create the biology of night waking, but it can shape its emotional intensity. What survives in the record suggests that humans have long treated the night as morally and psychologically dense, not just physically obscure. The consequences are intimate. A single waking can recruit the whole self. Memory enters. Regret enters. Forecasting enters. Sometimes even joy does this. Anticipation of a birth, a journey, or a beloved return can wake the body early. But the darker emotions tend to dominate because vigilance evolved around consequence, and the brain privileges what seems costly to ignore. A person who wakes at 3 often feels they have discovered a hidden truth about their life. By daylight, that truth may shrink back to ordinary size. The night did not reveal the world as it is. It revealed the world through a brain temporarily stripped of its balancing context. This is why the phrase "no reason" can be misleading. People say they wake at night for no reason because the reason is not always visible in the room, but invisible is not the same as absent. The trigger may be a pattern of stress, an unresolved grief, a bodily change, a remembered threat, or a layer of anticipation not fully conscious by day. The reason may also be small and cumulative rather than singular. Chronic uncertainty trains the body toward easier waking. Repeated emotional strain teaches the brain that the dark is not fully safe. Over time, this training can become self-reinforcing. The person begins to fear the waking itself, and that fear becomes one more thing the body monitors. None of this erases the older biological story. It completes it. Human beings still wake in the night because they are descended from creatures who could not afford complete oblivion. They still wake because sleep architecture allows it, but they also wake because civilization has moved danger inward, into attachment, obligation, memory, and abstraction. The old alarm now rings for subtler reasons. It rings for deadlines, for guilt, for possible illness, for social fracture, for the imagined future of people we love. In that sense, the modern night is not less dangerous than the ancient one. It is dangerous in ways the body can feel but not easily resolve. And that unresolved quality is the key. A sound in the grass can be checked, a dying fire can be fed, a door can be barred. But what can the waking body do with grief at 2:46 in the morning? What can it do with tomorrow's uncertainty? It listens, finds no external target, and remains alert. The very flexibility that once helped humans survive the dark now leaves them exposed to thought in its most potent hour. By the time sleep returns, if it returns quickly, the episode may seem shapeless, yet it has structure. The body wakes. The ancient vigilant system opens its eyes. The modern mind fills the room, and in that meeting, the night becomes not merely a place of external unknowns, but a chamber where the interior life of the species grows loud enough to break sleep on its own. From here, the mystery becomes even more precise. If fear, memory, and anticipation can wake us, how exactly do they do it in the body? What chemicals shift? What rhythms change? What mechanisms turn a sleeping human into a suddenly alert one? The old inheritance explains why waking remains possible. The next layer explains how it happens in flesh and blood. Minute by minute, in the chemistry of the night. By the time a person becomes aware of being awake, the chemistry has already shifted. That is one of the strangest parts of the experience. Consciousness arrives late. The body moves first. Somewhere below language, something changes in the balance between sleep and alertness, and the organism begins rising toward the surface before the mind has formed its first coherent thought. This is why waking in the night can feel so abrupt and so mysterious. It seems to come from nowhere. In reality, it comes from a sequence of bodily events that often begins minutes or even moments earlier, hidden beneath the threshold of awareness. Sleep is maintained by an elaborate negotiation among brain circuits, hormones, temperature rhythms, breathing patterns, and metabolic signals. No single switch controls it. The body is always managing pressure in two directions at once. One system promotes sleep, deepening disengagement and reducing responsiveness. Another maintains the ability to wake when waking becomes necessary. Through the night, these systems exchange influence in shifting proportions. Most of the time, the handover is smooth. Sometimes it is not. A slight disturbance in the chemistry of the moment can tilt the balance and lift the sleeper upward with surprising speed. Stress hormones play an obvious role here, though not always in the dramatic way people imagine. Cortisol is often treated as the villain of modern life, but it is not simply a bad chemical. It is part of the body's timing system, rising and falling across the day and night in patterns tied to wakefulness, energy, immune regulation, and anticipation. Under ordinary conditions, it tends to be lower earlier in the night, and then begins gradually rising toward morning. That rise is not a malfunction. It is one of the ways the body prepares to become awake, but the system is sensitive. Chronic stress, emotional strain, irregular routines, illness, and even expectation can distort its rhythm. A body carrying too much arousal may begin climbing toward wakefulness too early, as if morning were arriving before the dark has finished. Adrenaline, or more precisely the broader activation of the sympathetic nervous system, can sharpen the effect. A subtle sound, a bad dream, a momentary breathing irregularity, a sudden memory, a shift in body position, even a thought half-formed beneath sleep can trigger a burst of alerting chemistry. The heart quickens, muscles tense slightly, attention narrows. By the time the person realizes they are awake, the body has already prepared for action. This is why many nighttime awakenings feel charged even when nothing visible is wrong. The body does not wait for a full explanation before beginning its response. It acts on threshold, not on philosophical certainty. Temperature matters more than many people realize. Human sleep is tied closely to the body's internal thermal rhythm. Core temperature tends to drop as sleep deepens and reaches a low point in the final part of the night. That fall helps support sleep, but it also creates vulnerability to disturbance. A room that becomes too warm, too cold, too dry, or too stuffy can interrupt the process. More subtly, the body's own temperature changes can influence sleep depth and timing. One lesser-known detail is that even small deviations in thermal comfort can shift the nervous system toward lighter sleep without fully waking the person at once. By the time the waking becomes conscious, it can seem causeless, because the original trigger is simply the body deciding that the thermal environment is no longer ideal for deep rest. Blood sugar and metabolic state contribute as well. The body continues regulating fuel through the night, balancing stored energy, liver output, insulin responses, and the needs of the brain. In some people, late meals, alcohol, irregular eating patterns, or underlying metabolic issues can produce shifts that disturb sleep several hours later. a dip in blood sugar, or the body's effort to correct it may be enough to increase arousal. This does not mean that every nighttime waking is about food, but it does mean the sleeping body remains metabolically active in ways the conscious mind rarely appreciates. Hunger, fullness, dehydration, and digestive activity all whisper into the architecture of sleep. Breathing is even more fundamental. Every sleeping human becomes, for hours at a time, dependent on automatic rhythms the waking mind mostly takes for granted. If breathing grows shallow, obstructed, irregular, or briefly interrupted, the brain may respond by lifting the sleeper toward consciousness. Sometimes this happens dramatically. Often it happens so subtly that the person never connects waking with respiration at all. They simply know that they are suddenly awake, sometimes with a racing heart, a dry mouth, or a vague sense of alarm. The body has detected a threat to oxygen balance or airway patency and has chosen alertness over uninterrupted rest. In ancestral terms, that choice is not hard to understand. A sleeping organism that cannot maintain breathing has one overriding priority, and perfect continuity of sleep is not it. The heart, too, participates in this hidden conversation. Heart rate and blood pressure generally shift downward during deeper phases of sleep, but they are never static. They rise and fall with dreams, posture changes, breathing, temperature, stress responses, and the body's internal timing. A small cardiovascular change may not fully wake the sleeper, but in the right context it can help push the system upward. This is one reason nighttime waking can feel strangely physical before it feels mental. The body may already be in motion, chemically and physiologically, while the mind is still trying to catch up. Then there is the brain itself, cycling through its patterned stages. Human sleep is not a single state but a repeated sequence. Lighter sleep, deeper slow-wave sleep, and dream-rich phases all come and go across the night. The boundaries between them are biologically active moments, not smooth cinematic fades. A sleeper is often more vulnerable to awakening when moving through lighter stages or transitioning between states. This is true even in healthy sleep. The system is designed with entrances and exits built into it. A person who wakes at roughly similar times on different nights may be brushing repeatedly against these predictable biological thresholds. Scholars still debate exactly how sleep stage transitions interact with environmental and emotional triggers, but the evidence strongly suggests that the night contains natural windows of easier waking. This may explain why so many awakenings feel oddly synchronized, clustering in the same broad hours. People often report waking not randomly, but at 2, 3, or 4 in the morning, as though the body has an appointment with consciousness. In some cases it almost does. Those hours often coincide with lighter sleep, shifting hormone levels, falling or stabilizing temperature, and the slow biochemical turn toward morning. The body is not fully ready for the day, but neither is it sealed from it. It is in transit, and transit is vulnerable. Dreaming complicates the picture further. During dreaming sleep, especially vivid or emotionally charged episodes, the brain can activate bodily responses even while the person remains technically asleep. Heart rate changes, breathing shifts, emotional centers become highly engaged. Sometimes the dream itself is remembered and seems to explain the waking. Sometimes the dream vanishes instantly, leaving only the physiology behind, a pulse too fast, a chest too tight, an undefined sense that something has happened. The waking feels uncaused because the mental content that triggered it has already dissolved. What remains is the body's residue of alarm. One of the more unsettling truths about all this is how often the body can be right before the mind understands why. A person may wake feeling vaguely wrong, only to realize later that the room has become stuffy, that a fever is beginning, that stress has been building for days, or that they have been breathing poorly in sleep. The organism monitors continuously. It notices shifts before the self can narrate them. This is not mystical intuition, it is physiology. Yet because the language of waking comes after the event, the experience retains its eerie quality, as though some hidden intelligence has interrupted sleep without explanation. Of course, modern life can distort these systems badly. Chronic stress can push cortisol in the wrong direction. Alcohol can sedate at first and fragment later. Caffeine can linger longer than people think. Screens and bright light can delay the hormonal onset of sleep. Irregular schedules confuse timing signals. Heavy meals, pain, medication, and emotional overload all feed into the chemistry. But these modern pressures work best because the underlying system is already designed to be interruptible. They do not need to invent waking from scratch. They only need to exploit pathways the body has always had. No single chemical can explain why humans still wake at night for no reason. The reason is usually not singular. It is a layered event in which breathing, temperature, hormones, metabolism, sleep stage, and stored emotional load all converge on one outcome the body decides, however briefly, that sleep should loosen its grip. The conscious mind receives only the end product. It opens its eyes into darkness and asks for a clear cause. The body, having made its calculation in older and quieter language, offers none. That mismatch between mechanism and experience is what makes nighttime waking feel so uncanny. We want reasons that look like objects. We want a noise, a pain, a clear external trigger. But the biology of waking is more like weather inside a closed system. Pressures rise, thresholds shift, tiny conditions accumulate. A sleeping brain that has passed safely through dozens of cycles suddenly decides to surface, and the event enters awareness as a mystery. In truth, it is one of the body's most ordinary acts, and one of its least transparent. So the person awake at 3:18 in the morning may be standing at the endpoint of an entire invisible cascade. Cortisol may have drifted a little too high. Breathing may have narrowed for a moment. Temperature may have changed. Blood sugar may have shifted. A dream may have nudged emotional circuits. A stress-loaded nervous system may have lowered the waking threshold just enough. None of these alone may be dramatic. Together they become consciousness. The old watchman in the brain is stirred. And sleep breaks just enough for the modern self to notice. And once that self has noticed, modern life is often waiting to make the problem worse, because the ancient chemistry of waking now collides with electric light, glowing screens, late meals, social pressure, and routines that teach the body to stay perpetually overstimulated. The biology of sudden waking may be old, but the world that now agitates it is something else entirely. A world exquisitely good at taking a watchful brain and making it watch far more than it ever evolved to bear. If the ancient human nervous system is built to wake easily enough to survive the night, modern life has become exceptionally skilled at provoking that wakefulness. It does so not through one dramatic assault, but through accumulation. Electric light extends the day beyond the logic of sunset. Screens brighten the face at the precise hours when darkness once signaled the body to begin retreating. Meals arrive late. Work crosses time zones. Worry follows people into bed in the form of unfinished messages, unresolved tasks, and a culture that treats rest as something to optimize rather than inhabit. The old watchful brain is still there, still willing to surface at slight disturbances, and now it lives in an environment almost perfectly designed to keep disturbing it. Light may be the most powerful example because it reaches so deeply into human timing. For most of the species' history, night arrives gradually and with authority. Fire and moonlight alter darkness, but neither imitates the sheer intensity and consistency of modern artificial illumination. Electric light changes evenings into a second daytime, especially indoors where the body receives fewer natural signals about the hour than it once did. Bright light after sunset can delay the release of melatonin and push sleep later, but the workday often remains fixed. The result is not merely less sleep, it is a nervous system entering the night at the wrong phase, compressed, overstimulated, and less stable. A body that falls asleep later than its biology prefers may still carry enough strain to wake more easily in the early hours. Screens add another layer because they do more than emit light. They carry emotional and cognitive charge. A firelit evening around familiar people is one thing. An evening spent moving rapidly through news, messages, arguments, entertainment, work requests, and algorithmic stimulation is something else entirely. The human brain is not simply being kept awake by brightness. It is being kept socially engaged, alert, and unsettled. One lesser-known detail in the modern problem is how little closure such stimulation provides. Ancient evening activity often tapered into recognizable limits. Modern digital life does not taper naturally. It scrolls, it reloads, it invites one more check, one more message, one more reason to remain slightly activated. The sleeper enters the night carrying not only delayed circadian timing, but unfinished cognitive motion. Meals have changed as well. In older settings, food is often constrained by daylight, labor, season, and availability. In modern life, dinner can arrive late, be heavy, be rich in alcohol, sugar, or stimulants, and be followed almost immediately by bed. Digestion continues through the first part of the night, sometimes with consequences the sleeper notices only later. Reflux, blood sugar fluctuations, warmth, dehydration, and subtle metabolic arousal can all increase the odds of waking. The body, which evolved to rest in closer alignment with simpler rhythms of light and activity, now spends its nights processing schedules and substances that often refuse that alignment. Caffeine belongs to the same story. It is one of the most ordinary chemicals in modern life and one of the easiest to underestimate. People rarely think of morning coffee as part of the reason they wake at night, yet caffeine can linger in the system far longer than the subjective feeling of alertness suggests. Afternoon intake, common and socially invisible, can reduce sleep depth or increase fragmentation hours later. The irony is almost comic. A culture short on sleep relies on stimulants to function by day, and those stimulants can quietly help preserve the conditions that break sleep again at night. Alcohol creates an even stranger illusion. It often feels like a sedative because it helps people fall asleep faster, but the sleep it produces can become shallower, more unstable, and more broken as the night progresses. The body metabolizes it, temperature shifts, breathing can worsen, and the brain may rebound into lighter sleep or full waking in the small hours. Many people interpret these awakenings as anxiety or bad luck, without realizing that what felt like help at bedtime has merely delayed the disturbance into another phase of the night. Modern life is full of such bargains, immediate relief exchanged for deeper instability later. Irregular routine may be the most modern trigger of all. Shift work, long commutes, jet lag, late-night entertainment, flexible office culture, and the quiet expectation of constant availability all teach the body not to trust the usual markers of time. A species built around repeating rhythms does not thrive when those rhythms are continually moved. Sleep pressure, hormone release, temperature cycles, digestion, and emotional regulation all work best with some degree of regularity. When bedtime drifts across hours or changes sharply between weekdays and weekends, the system becomes less coherent. A less coherent system is easier to wake. What once looked like an isolated midnight problem may actually be the nighttime symptom of a life lived against one's own internal timing. Modern stress also differs from ancient stress in a crucial way. It is often chronic rather than acute. The nervous system evolved beautifully for emergencies, for brief, consequential surges of energy and vigilance. It is less well suited to endless low-level activation. Bills remain unpaid for months. Emails remain unanswered overnight. Social comparison never stops. Work can follow a person into the bedroom through a glowing rectangle that also carries family news, world crisis, and entertainment. The brain has no simple off switch for these overlapping domains because, in biological terms, such a condition is unprecedented. It is as though the old campfire has been replaced by 1,000 tiny signals, all insisting they matter, all asking to be monitored, all surviving into the dark. This helps explain why so many nighttime awakenings feel mentally crowded the instant they occur. The body surfaces and finds cue already waiting. There are tomorrow's obligations, the half-finished conversation, the unread message, the subtle shame carried from the afternoon, the fear about health, money, family, status, age. In older environments, waking may reveal weather or silence, or the simple presence of other sleeping bodies. In modern environments, waking reveals the backlog of a psychologically saturated life. The room may be quieter than ever, but the mind is louder. Temperature control, ironically, does not rescue the situation as cleanly as it promises. Indoor comfort allows humans to escape many natural fluctuations. Yet modern buildings can also create stale air, excessive warmth, inconsistent cooling, and sensory artificiality that do not always support deep sleep. People may stay up under bright light, eat late in heated rooms, then sleep in spaces either too warm or too dry for ideal rest. The body still relies on subtle cooling to descend properly into sleep, and when that descent is blunted, the night can become lighter and easier to break. The very technologies designed to liberate people from environmental inconvenience sometimes end by confusing the older body they are meant to serve. There is also the problem of expectation. Modern sleep culture has become intensely self-conscious. People track sleep with devices, read about optimization, worry about sleep debt, and monitor their nights as if they were performance reports. Some of this can be useful, but it also creates a vicious loop. A person who wakes briefly may immediately begin calculating damage. Have I lost an hour? Will tomorrow be ruined? Why is this happening again? The mind turns the waking into a verdict. That verdict raises arousal. The arousal makes returning to sleep harder. A pattern that might once have been brief becomes prolonged because the sleeper is now afraid not only of the world, but of wakefulness itself. Scholars still debate how much of the modern sleep crisis is truly new and how much reflects better recognition of old patterns. The evidence remains mixed in places. Pre-industrial people also live with poor sleep for countless reasons, yet no single explanation fully accounts for the modern combination of electric light, digital stimulation, social overextension, chemical assistance, and misaligned schedules. The contemporary environment is unusual in one decisive respect. It weakens the cues that help sleep begin while multiplying the cues that make waking easier. It does not create the ancient watchful brain, but it keeps tapping it on the shoulder. This is why even healthy, safe people can find themselves awake at 3 in the morning with no obvious external cause. Their sleep is not occurring in a vacuum. It is occurring after a day of artificial brightness, fragmented attention, prolonged sitting, delayed meals, hidden stimulants, psychological residue, and perhaps no true transition into darkness at all. The body, already designed to cycle through lighter and deeper phases, reaches one of its more permeable moments and encounters a system still full of unfinished activation. Consciousness enters almost as a byproduct of modern excess pressing against ancient permeability. There is a bleak elegance to this mismatch. Human beings build a world to make life easier and end by feeding their own oldest vulnerabilities. They conquer darkness with switches and screens, then discover that the conquered darkness still survives inside the nervous system as rhythm, expectation, and need. They invent chemical alertness to survive fatigue, then use chemical sedation to survive alertness, and wonder why the night becomes unstable. They live longer, safer, more controlled lives, yet carry into bed more abstraction, more information, and more future than any previous generation could easily imagine. So the person waking in the small hours is not simply confronting an old evolutionary habit. They're confronting a modern environment that amplifies it at every stage. The bedroom may look calm, but the day leading into it has often been anything but calm. The body is asked to shift too quickly from vigilance to surrender, from stimulation to silence, from endless input to the total trust sleep requires. Sometimes it refuses, or rather, it does what it has always done when conditions feel uncertain enough. It sleeps lightly, checks often, and rises when some threshold is crossed. And yet modern life is not the whole story. If waking at night were merely the byproduct of screens, stress, and electric light, then other animals would have little to tell about it. But they do. Across the living world, sleep takes forms that are stranger, more fragmented, and more conditional than human beings usually imagine. Looking outward again, beyond our own bedrooms and schedules, reveals that the puzzle of waking in darkness may belong to something broader than modern dysfunction. It may belong to the basic problem of how living creatures rest without surrendering too much of their grip on survival. Once the human story is set beside the wider animal world, the expectation of perfectly smooth sleep begins to look even more peculiar. Nature is not full of creatures sinking each night into long, sealed unconsciousness, untouched by change until morning. It is full of compromise. Rest is everywhere, but it takes astonishingly varied forms, each shaped by danger, ecology, metabolism, and the practical problem of staying alive while temporarily giving up some control. Human sleep, with all its cycles and interruptions, belongs inside that larger pattern. It is unusual in some ways, but not in the way modern culture often assumes. The truly strange thing may not be that people wake at night. The strange thing may be that they expect not to. Many animals sleep lightly because they must. Herbivores exposed in open landscapes cannot afford total oblivion. Birds roost in places that are protective but not invulnerable. Marine mammals solve the problem in ways so remarkable they barely resemble familiar sleep at all, allowing one hemisphere of the brain to rest more deeply, while the other remains sufficiently active to maintain breathing and orientation. Even among land mammals, sleep is often fragmented, opportunistic, and closely tied to patterns of feeding and threat. A creature eats when it can, rests when it can, wakes when it must. The biological world is filled not with perfect sleepers, but with survivors. Humans are not dolphins, deer, or migratory birds, and direct comparisons have limits. Still, the broader lesson matters. Sleep in nature is rarely absolute. It is shaped by risk, and risk rarely disappears. The same principle that makes a gazelle more responsive at night than a house cat operates, in more complex form, across many species. The body must recover, but it must also remain recoverable to the world. This is the ancient equation. Human beings solve it through sociality, shelter, fire, flexible sleep stages, and perhaps older habits of segmented rest. Other animals solve it differently. What links them is not identical behavior, but the recurring fact that sleep is almost always designed under constraint. This matters because it challenges a common modern illusion, the idea that waking in darkness is evidence of malfunction, rather than a normal expression of biological caution. When people compare themselves only to an imagined ideal of machine-like sleep, they forget that the living world did not evolve around comfort metrics. It evolved around consequences. The deer that sleeps too deeply may become food. The seabird that rests without guarding balance may fall. The primate that loses awareness entirely in a vulnerable sleeping site may fail to detect danger in time. In that company, the human sleeper who wakes briefly to sample the environment does not look defective. He looks familiar. Primates are especially revealing because they bring the comparison closer to home. Different primate species show different sleep patterns depending on body size, group living, predation risk, sleeping location, and social habits. Great apes build nests or choose sleeping sites with care, balancing comfort and security in ways that already sound faintly human. A sleeping place is not just somewhere the body stops. It is a decision about safety. Even there, rest is conditional. Group sleeping can reduce risk but create disturbance. Tree sleeping protects against some dangers but introduces others. The problem is always the same. The animal must surrender enough to recover, but not so much that it cannot respond. One lesser-known and quietly important detail is that animals often display something like sentinel behavior, even without formal coordination. In group-living species, individuals may not all enter the deepest phases of sleep simultaneously. Differences in age, status, fatigue, reproductive condition, and environment can create rolling patterns of vigilance. This is not always conscious cooperation. It can emerge from biology and circumstance. The result is a group that, taken as a whole, remains more responsive than any isolated sleeper. That possibility resonates strongly with what anthropologists and sleep researchers have suggested about humans in shared sleeping environments. The camp, the household, the clustered sleeping group may never be fully unconscious at once. Someone is usually easier to wake, or already half awake. Birds offer a particularly sharp lesson, because many species must sleep in exposed places where the cost of total vulnerability would be obvious. Some show asymmetries in sleep depth depending on position in the group, with individuals on the edges remaining more alert than those protected in the middle. Again, humans are not birds, but the evolutionary logic is instructive. Vulnerability shapes sleep architecture. Position matters. Social arrangement matters. The body adapts to its place in a collective structure. It is not difficult to imagine similar pressures acting on ancient human groups sleeping in rings around a fire, in clustered shelters, or in households where some members are naturally more responsive than others. Predator-prey dynamics sharpen the pattern across species. Animals exposed to high predation risk often sleep less deeply, in shorter bouts, or in more interruptible ways than safer species. That does not mean they are healthier or more rested. It means sleep is being traded off against survival. This trade-off is one of the oldest facts in biology. Humans shaped under long histories of predation, exposure, and social threat, are unlikely to stand outside it simply because modern people prefer uninterrupted rest. The ancient human nervous system did not evolve in a vacuum of safety. It evolved in the company of other organisms, all solving the same hard problem by different means. At the same time, animal comparisons reveal limits in the easy evolutionary story. Some species sleep surprisingly deeply despite danger. Others show flexibility humans do not. Some can rest in brief bursts that would leave a human in ruins. Others endure long deprivation during migration, mating, or parenting in ways that stretch ordinary definitions of sleep. This is important because it prevents the argument from becoming too neat. Human night waking cannot be explained simply by saying all animals wake to survive. Biology is more complicated than that. Scholars still debate which features of human sleep are direct adaptations, which are byproducts of other traits, and which have been heavily reshaped by culture. The evidence remains incomplete, especially when trying to infer ancient selection pressures from modern patterns. That uncertainty should not be hidden. Even so, the wider animal world does support one strong conclusion: fragmented, conditional, or strategically interruptible sleep is not an aberration in life. It is common, continuous, perfectly insulated unconsciousness is the luxury condition, not the default one. Humans may wish for it, but wishing does not make it ancestral. The body is built in a lineage of creatures for whom sleeping too deeply, too blindly, or too inflexibly could carry cost. That lineage does not dictate every midnight awakening, but it frames the problem in a more honest way. There is also a humbling implication here. Human beings are proud of their intelligence, their architecture, their medicine, and their self-awareness. Yet at night they remain biologically legible. They are still mammals negotiating old thresholds. They still cool into sleep, cycle through vulnerable phases, respond to sound and internal change, and wake more easily when the environment or the mind feels unstable. The vocabulary has changed. The bedroom has changed. The circadian disruptions now include smartphones and shift work rather than hyenas and failing embers. But the deeper pattern still resembles the animal predicament from which humans never fully escaped. This resemblance helps explain why attempts to dominate sleep often fail. Sleep is not simply a behavior that can be ordered by will. It is an ecological relationship between the body and its conditions. Other animals know this without knowing it. They rest where they can, how they can, as deeply as they dare. Humans add self-consciousness, expectation, and technology, but they do not abolish the underlying relationship. The modern person tracking sleep with a device and cursing a 3 a.m. waking is still, at bottom, facing the same kind of compromise the living world has always faced. How much can one let go, and for how long, without losing too much of the world? Seen this way, human night waking becomes less a bizarre personal flaw and more a local expression of a universal tension. Life needs sleep. Life is endangered by sleep. Every species solves this badly in its own way, because there is no perfect solution. There are only workable balances. Humans happen to solve it with unusually flexible brains, dense social reliance, symbolic thought, and ancient nervous systems that remain ready to surface. This may not feel comforting at 3 a.m, but it is clarifying. The body is not uniquely broken. It is participating in one of biology's oldest compromises. Still, comparison alone cannot settle the matter. Knowing that other animals also sleep conditionally does not tell us exactly why a modern human wakes in the night, nor how much of that waking belongs to inheritance, how much to current stress, and how much to cultural expectation. That is where the mystery tightens again. Science can explain some of the mechanics, history can recover older norms, and evolution can supply plausible pressures. But the final balance among them remains unsettled. Humans are left with a deeply familiar experience and no single theory that fully contains it. And perhaps that is fitting. The night has always resisted neat explanations. It is the hour in which biology, environment, memory, and uncertainty meet most intimately. The body wakes, and behind that waking stand many possible causes, some ancient, some immediate, some measurable, some only inferred. The next step, then, is not to choose one explanation too quickly, but to face the unresolved question directly. After all the camps, the fires, the first sleeps, the bells, the hormones, and the animal parallels, what does science still not know about why humans wake in darkness for no obvious reason? After all the obvious pieces are placed on the table, one uncomfortable fact remains. The mystery is still not solved. Human beings have examined sleep with extraordinary tools, measured brain waves, tracked hormones, mapped circadian rhythms, compared cultures, observed animals, and reconstructed older habits from scattered historical records. The picture is far richer than it once was. Yet the simple experience of waking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason still resists being reduced to one final answer. It lives at the intersection of too many systems at once. Biology explains part of it. History explains part of it. Environment explains part of it. Emotion explains part of it. But no single explanation fully accounts for the whole. This is not a failure of science so much as a reminder of what kind of thing sleep actually is. Sleep is not one organ, one behavior, or one chemical event. It is a changing state involving brain networks, bodily rhythms, metabolic conditions, learned associations, social history, and environment. The sleeper is not merely a brain in a vacuum. The sleeper is a body with a past, lying in a room shaped by culture, carrying a day's emotional residue, moving through an ancient physiological cycle. When such a system wakes, the cause may be multiple before it is noticeable at all. By the time consciousness arrives and asks why, the answer may already be distributed across several levels that do not present themselves neatly to introspection. One of the biggest unresolved questions is how much modern night waking should be interpreted as adaptation and how much as side effect. Evolutionary explanations are powerful because they make intuitive sense. It is easy to imagine ancestral humans benefiting from sleep that remains somewhat alert and interruptible. But intuitive sense is not proof. Scholars still debate whether specific features of human sleep were directly selected because they improved nighttime vigilance, or whether some of those features arise as byproducts of broader mammalian sleep architecture, brain size, social complexity, or other constraints. In other words, humans may wake at night partly because waking can be useful, but also because the kind of brain humans possess may simply produce a more dynamic and fragile sleep state as a consequence of its complexity. This distinction matters because adaptive stories can become too elegant. They can make every inconvenience look purposeful. Real evolution is not so clean. It often produces workable systems full of compromise, waste, and historical leftovers. A tendency to wake at night could be partly adaptive in ancestral settings, and partly just inseparable from the broader design of a large, flexible, highly social brain. The evidence remains incomplete because deep evolutionary processes do not leave direct labels behind. Researchers must infer from physiology, comparative biology, anthropology, and logic, and inference has limits. The old world can be reconstructed only in outline. Another unresolved question concerns the balance between circadian timing and sleep homeostasis. The body uses one broad system to regulate when sleep should occur and another to regulate how much sleep pressure is built up. These systems usually work together, but not perfectly. In some nighttime awakenings, it may be that circadian signals are becoming more alerting too early. In others, sleep pressure may have weakened enough that even small disturbances can produce full wakefulness. In still others, the issue may be emotional arousal overriding both. Untangling these possibilities is difficult because the same outward event, lying awake at 3 a.m., can emerge from very different internal pathways. The historical question remains open as well. The evidence for segmented sleep is compelling enough to challenge modern assumptions, but not broad enough to close the case for all places and times. Literate records tend to privilege certain classes, regions, and periods. Many human societies leave little direct evidence of how ordinary people slept, how long they lay awake, or what they considered normal. Even when references to first sleep and second sleep appear, they do not tell us whether the pattern was universal, seasonal, or declining already under changing social pressures. Historians can show that divided sleep existed and mattered. They cannot yet say with complete confidence how far it stretched through human experience, or exactly how it interacted with biology rather than merely with custom. There is also the modern problem of measurement. Sleep science is extraordinarily good at recording certain kinds of data, and less good at capturing the subjective meaning of being awake in darkness. Electrodes can mark transitions. Devices can estimate stage shifts. Respiratory monitors can catch breathing irregularities. But the felt experience, the strange emotional atmosphere of nighttime waking, remains harder to reduce. A person can have a brief awakening that is physiologically ordinary yet psychologically enormous. Another can have several awakenings and barely remember them. The biology may look similar. The lived reality is not. This gap between measurement and meaning is one reason the phenomenon still feels elusive even under scientific scrutiny. One lesser-known difficulty is that laboratory sleep is not always natural sleep. People sleep differently when observed, wired, scheduled, and removed from the environments in which their habits formed. Valuable knowledge comes from laboratories, but so do distortions. The same is true for modern field studies. Small-scale societies can offer insight into human sleep outside industrial life, yet they are not fossilized windows into prehistory. They live in present worlds shaped by disease, markets, colonial histories, and local conditions of their own. Comparing across these settings is useful, but it must be done carefully. The temptation to draw one straight line from a contemporary foraging group to Paleolithic ancestors is strong and often misleading. The role of culture remains especially hard to quantify. How much does expectation itself shape waking? If a society treats midnight wakefulness as normal, does that reduce the distress and duration of waking enough to change sleep outcomes? If a society treats it as pathological, does that amplify arousal and create more insomnia from the same raw biological events? These are not trivial questions. They suggest that sleep is not only regulated by hormones and neurons, but by interpretation. The body wakes, and culture decides whether that waking should be absorbed, feared, or resisted. Science can measure heart rate and cortical activity, but the cultural script surrounding the event may still alter what happens next. Then there is the issue of individual variation. Not all humans are built or shaped the same way. Genetics influence chronotype, arousal threshold, metabolic regulation, and stress sensitivity. Early life conditions alter nervous system calibration. Trauma can make sleep lighter and more easily broken. Parenthood changes responsiveness. Aging changes sleep architecture. Hormonal transitions change it again. Illness, pain, medication, and social instability all push differently on the same underlying system. This means that even if there were a general answer to why humans wake at night, that answer would still fracture into many versions once it reached actual lives. The species-wide story and the personal story can both be true, yet not identical. This complexity is frustrating, but it also protects the subject from false simplicity. It prevents waking in the night from being reduced to one slogan: not primal memory alone, not stress alone, not screens alone, not hormones alone. The real explanation is layered because human beings are layered. They are animals carrying deep time solutions into historically recent environments. They are social creatures whose bodies respond to kin, obligation, and loss. They are technological creatures who alter light, temperature, food, and attention. They are symbolic creatures who can frighten themselves with imagined futures as effectively as with real sounds in the dark. Any science of sleep that ignores one of these layers becomes too thin. There is even a philosophical edge to the uncertainty. Sleep sits near the boundary of conscious control, and human beings are famously uncomfortable with things that shape them without asking permission. People want to know why they wake because they want to believe that enough explanation will restore mastery. Sometimes explanation helps, often it does. Yet the persistence of nighttime waking suggests there may always remain a portion of the night that does not fully submit to reason. The body keeps older time than the mind does. It wakes according to thresholds and rhythms the self cannot completely supervise. That does not make the experience mystical, it makes it humbling. So the science remains unfinished, though not empty. It can tell us that waking is often built into normal sleep architecture. It can show that breathing, temperature, hormones, and stress chemistry matter. It can reveal that historical people often did not assume one seamless night. It can suggest that ancestral vigilance likely shaped the human sleep system, even if the precise extent remains debated. It can show that modern life amplifies an already interruptible design. What it cannot yet do is compress all of this into one cause that fits every waking body in every darkened room. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that nighttime waking persists because human sleep itself is a negotiated state rather than a perfect shutdown. It is negotiated with the environment, with internal chemistry, with inherited vigilance, with emotional life, and with cultural expectation. The sleeper is never just sleeping. The sleeper is participating in an ancient compromise that changes form, but never entirely disappears. That is why the experience feels both personal and impersonal at once, both intimate and strangely old. It belongs to the individual life, but it also belongs to the species, and that unresolved quality has consequences. When people believe every waking is evidence of breakdown, they often add fear to an already delicate system. They turn one layer of uncertainty into two. The cost is not only lost sleep, it is the feeling of being at war with one's own body. That war may be one of the most modern features of the story, because whatever science has not yet settled, one thing is already clear. A watchful brain carries a price. The old inheritance that once may have helped human beings survive the dark can, in the wrong setting, become exhausting. The next step is to see what that cost looks like, not only in the body, but in emotion, culture, and the way entire societies learn to fear the very pattern that may once have been ordinary. The cost of a watchful brain is not measured only in lost hours. It appears in mood, patience, memory, immunity, judgment, pain, tolerance. and the quiet emotional tone with which a person meets the day, a body that wakes too often may still function, just as a structure can remain standing while carrying hidden cracks. But over time the strain accumulates. What may once have been adaptive in a world of real night danger becomes, under modern conditions, a pattern that can wear down the very creature it was built to protect. This is the cruel twist at the center of the story. The brain that remains available to the world survives because it does not let go easily enough. In safer eras, that same reluctance can become a burden. The immediate effects are familiar and deceptively simple. A person who wakes repeatedly may not feel dramatically ill. They may simply feel thinner somehow, less buffered, less capable of absorbing friction. Small irritations bite harder. Concentration blurs sooner. Memory becomes less reliable in ordinary ways that are easy to dismiss until they begin gathering. A name slips, a task is forgotten, an email is read twice without being understood. These are not cinematic failures. They are the slow expenses of fragmented rest, paid in attention and steadiness. The watchful night quietly taxes the daylight self. Emotion often bears the first visible mark. Sleep fragmentation can make the mind more reactive, more pessimistic, and less resilient in the face of minor strain. Problems feel larger. Social interactions require more effort. Patience narrows. One lesser known but important detail from modern sleep research is that even subtle reductions in sleep continuity can affect emotional regulation, not only by making people tired, but by altering how strongly the brain responds to negative stimuli. In practical terms, this means that a person waking frequently at night may begin living in a world that feels harsher than it did before, not because the world changed, but because the nervous system has lost some of its buffering capacity. That change in emotional tone can become self-reinforcing. The person begins dreading the night because the night has become the source of tomorrow's weakness. They go to bed already worried about waking. That worry increases arousal. Arousal makes waking easier. The waking then confirms the fear. What may have begun as an ordinary physiological tendency or a temporary stress response can harden into a deeper pattern, because the mind starts treating sleep as a test it keeps failing. Under those conditions, the bedroom becomes less a place of refuge than a stage for anticipatory defeat. The body senses that tension and remains more prepared, not less. This is one reason cultures eventually learn to fear night waking so intensely. Once societies become organized around productivity, punctuality, and daytime performance, sleep is no longer only a biological need, it becomes a moral and economic resource. To sleep well is to be competent, disciplined, healthy, productive. To sleep badly is to fall behind, to lose sharpness, to become unreliable. In such a world, waking in the middle of the night acquires significance far beyond the event itself. It is no longer a neutral fact of human physiology. It becomes a threat to status and function. People do not just dislike it. They come to interpret it as a sign that something about the self is failing to meet the standards of the age. That moral pressure is historically revealing. Earlier societies certainly care about sleep, but they do not always tie it so tightly to personal optimization. The industrial and post-industrial world does. The disciplined workday, the measured schedule, the school morning, the train, the factory whistle, the office clock, and later the culture of self-improvement all sharpen the consequences of a broken night. What was once tolerable becomes costly. What was once a common pause in darkness becomes a disruption with economic penalties. Scholars still debate exactly when and how this transition hardens across different societies, because the evidence varies by class, region, and period. But the broad movement is clear enough. Sleep becomes instrumentalized, and the sleeper becomes more afraid of any irregularity that threatens daytime efficiency. The body suffers under that fear in very material ways. Chronic fragmented sleep can influence blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, appetite regulation, immune function, and the way pain is experienced. It can worsen vulnerability to depression and anxiety, though the direction of cause is often tangled because distress also worsens sleep. No single explanation fully accounts for every medical consequence, and not every person who wakes at night develops illness. The evidence remains nuanced. Still, the overall picture is strong. Repeated interruptions in sleep are not simply unpleasant. They can gradually alter the physiology of waking life in ways that spill far beyond the bedroom. There is a tragic irony in the relationship between vigilance and illness. The body may wake because it is trying to protect itself, monitoring breathing, temperature, internal discomfort, or emotional load. Yet repeated waking can itself become a source of harm. The guard keeps sounding the alarm until the fortress grows weak from alarm alone. This is not a contradiction. It is a trade-off extended beyond its useful range. The same is true in other parts of biology. Inflammation protects until it damages. Stress energizes until it depletes. Vigilance preserves until it exhausts. Night waking belongs to this same uneasy category of bodily behaviors that are valuable in moderation and costly in excess. The cultural imagination responds to this cost in telling ways. Modern language about sleep is full of struggle. People battle insomnia, chase better sleep, hack sleep, optimize sleep, repair sleep, track sleep, recover sleep. The tone is technical and adversarial. There's little sense that waking in the night might once have belonged to an accepted human rhythm. Instead, there is urgency, as though any fracture in unconsciousness is a malfunction requiring intervention. Some of this language reflects real suffering, and it should not be mocked. But it also reveals how far modern societies have drifted from older, more flexible relationships with the night. The body wakes in an ancient way. The culture answers with performance anxiety. This performance anxiety is distributed unequally, just as sleep itself has always been. Those with irregular jobs, caregiving burdens, financial precarity, chronic pain, trauma histories, unsafe housing, or crowded homes often pay more heavily for fragmented nights. They have fewer buffers, less control over the sleeping environment, and less freedom to recover by day. Meanwhile, the ideal of perfect sleep is often sold most aggressively to people with the greatest capacity to approximate it. Here again, sleep reveals society rather than floating above it. The night is biological, but its consequences are political and economic as well. A watchful brain is harder to live with when the day offers no mercy. There is also a more intimate cost, one harder to measure but deeply felt alienation from the body itself. People who wake in the night repeatedly often begin distrusting their own physiology. They resent it, monitor it, bargain with it. Why are you doing this? What is wrong with you? Why can you not just stay asleep? This is one of the saddest outcomes of the modern sleep story. A pattern that may once have been part of ordinary human adaptation becomes interpreted as betrayal. The person does not simply suffer fatigue. They feel abandoned by the one system that should, in theory, let them rest. That emotional rift can be as painful as the sleep loss itself, and yet the fear is understandable. Fragmented sleep narrows the future. It makes tomorrow feel heavier before it arrives. people become afraid not only of the dark interval itself, but of what it predicts for the morning, the meeting, the caregiving, the drive, the exam, the ordinary demands that require steadiness. The night starts to colonize the day. That may be the deepest cost of all. Awaking at 2:30 in the morning is no longer just 20 unwelcome minutes. It becomes the shadow under the entire next day, and soon under the night that follows. This is how societies come to fear what may once have been ordinary. They do not fear the pattern because it is wholly unnatural. They fear it because the conditions of modern life have made its costs more punishing. An ancient watchfulness that might once have been absorbed into flexible, communal nights now collides with rigid schedules, solitary bedrooms, and psychological saturation. The body remains old. The penalties become new. The result is a culture that treats one of its oldest inheritances as an enemy. Yet even within this conflict, something more complicated remains true. The waking brain is not only defective, not only anxious, not only maladapted, it is also persistent, attentive, and in a strange way, loyal. It keeps checking because some part of it still believes the night matters. It still believes the organism should not fully disappear while darkness lasts. That belief can become burdensome, but it did not arise from nowhere. It belongs to a very long history of survival. And that is why the story cannot end with pathology alone. The cost is real, but so is the inheritance. To understand why humans still wake at night, one has to hold both ideas together without forcing either one to disappear. The pattern can be exhausting now and still have made sense once. It can deserve compassion without being a defect in every case. It can damage health in some forms and still reveal something ancient about the kind of creatures humans have always been. The final step, then, is not to cure the mystery completely, because the mystery may never submit to one clean answer. It is to listen differently, to see whether waking in darkness might sometimes be less a failure than an echo, a faint surviving behavior from older nights, older risks, older social worlds, still sounding inside modern bodies that no longer know quite what to do with it. The night watcher remains with us. The question is whether we can recognize him for what he is, not a ghost. Not a mistake, but one of the oldest companions the species has ever carried into sleep. For all the science, all the history, and all the modern frustration gathered around sleep, the final image is surprisingly simple. A person wakes in darkness and listens, before explanation, before self-judgment, before the familiar machinery of modern worry begins its work. There is a brief and almost ancient act of attention. The body checks the night. It does not yet know whether the signal is meaningful. It only knows that something, internal or external, has crossed a threshold, and that consciousness should rise just enough to notice. This may be one of the oldest surviving gestures in human life, the small refusal to vanish completely while the world remains uncertain. That gesture has followed the species across extraordinary distances. It passes through open camps and caves, through firelit circles and smoky huts, through walled towns and bell-struck cities, through farmhouses, tenements, apartments, and climate-controlled rooms. It survives because every age gives it new material. Once it listened for predators and weather, then it listened for embers, infants, footsteps, church bells, debt, illness, and grief. Now it listens for alarms, messages, tomorrow's obligations, the strange unrest of a body saturated by light and overstimulation. The old waking persists not because human beings fail to become civilized, but because civilization never abolished the conditions that make vigilance useful. It only rearranged them. This is why waking in the night can feel both irrational and deeply reasonable at once. The conscious mind looks around the room and finds no threat. The deeper body is less easily persuaded. It is shaped by long practice in worlds where danger is often subtle, where silence can mean change just as much as noise, where sleeping too deeply can carry costs not apparent until too late. That world is no longer the literal environment of most sleepers, but its logic is still lodged in their biology. What survives in the record suggests that people once lived with this more comfortably than many do now. They did not always expect one smooth block of oblivion. They often made room for waking, named it, used it, absorbed it into the structure of the night. The modern urge to treat every interruption as failure may be one of the newest features in the story. There is something sobering in that realization, because it shifts the question from what is wrong with me to what kind of creature am I. Humans are not built for perfect detachment from the world. They are built for flexible rest, for cycles, for responsiveness, for sleeping in conditions that were rarely ideal and often uncertain. They are also built for meaning, and meaning complicates everything. Once the human mind becomes capable of carrying memory, anticipation, status, guilt, and imagined futures, the night becomes filled not only with sounds from outside but with significance from within. The old alarm remains, but its targets multiply. The body wakes not only for the rustle in the grass, but for the unfinished argument, the child's fever, the unpaid bill, the appointment before dawn, the fear that something fragile may break. And yet there is still a hidden continuity beneath all these changes. Whether the cause is external disturbance, internal chemistry, emotional strain, or ancient habit, waking in the dark still begins with orientation. The ears open, the breathing is checked, the room is sampled. For one moment the body behaves as though darkness deserves respect. That respect may be out of proportion to the actual danger in a modern bedroom, but it is not meaningless. It is the residue of a long education in uncertainty. The species learned, over immense time, that the night could not be trusted completely. It learned to rest without surrendering all the way. That lesson is still being enacted in people who have never slept outdoors in their lives. This does not mean people should romanticize poor sleep. Fragmented nights can be miserable. Chronic waking can signal real problems and deserves serious attention when it persists. Compassion requires honesty. Some wakefulness is a survival echo. Some is modern overload. Some is illness. Some is grief working at hours when grief grows louder. No single explanation fully accounts for it. But there is value in recognizing that the waking itself may not always be absurd. It may be the body doing exactly what bodies like ours have done for longer than memory, surfacing briefly to ask whether the world has changed. Perhaps that is the quietest answer available. Humans still wake at night for no reason because the reason is older than the rooms they sleep in and subtler than the mind can always detect. They wake because sleep is not a perfect shutdown. They wake because the brain moves in cycles. They wake because the body monitors breath, temperature, chemistry, and threat. They wake because history once made room for divided nights. They wake because modern life aggravates old vulnerabilities. They wake because they are descended from creatures who survived by never disappearing completely into darkness. The mystery remains, but it is not empty anymore. It has shape. It has age. It has a human face. By the time morning arrives, that midnight vigilance usually seems small again. Daylight reduces it. Coffee argues with it. Work obscures it. Yet the fact remains. In millions of rooms, in every age sophisticated enough to keep records and in countless ages before records exist, humans open their eyes in the dark and listen before they know why. That is not just a nuisance of modern stress. It is one of the oldest unfinished conversations between the species and the night. The deeper comfort, if there is one, lies not in the promise that waking will vanish, but in the understanding that it may not be senseless. The body is not always betraying itself. Sometimes it is revealing itself, showing the old design beneath the modern expectation, reminding the sleeper that rest has always been conditional, always negotiated, always braided with a little readiness. The night watcher is still there, patient, inconvenient, strangely faithful. He does not know about deadlines or electric bills or sleep trackers. He knows only that darkness has not yet ended, and that for a brief moment it may be wise to rise, listen, and wait. The room is quiet. The hour feels suspended. Nothing happens. Gradually the pulse slows. The body, having completed its ancient inspection, begins to loosen again. Consciousness sinks. The watcher steps back. Sleep returns, not as a perfect conquest of the night, but as the old compromise continuing, one more time, in a species that has never fully stopped listening. In the end, the mystery of waking at night leads somewhere larger than sleep. It leads to the strange continuity of being human, to the fact that modern lives are lived inside bodies assembled for older worlds. The walls are thicker now. The fires are hidden in switches and wires. The predators are fewer. The roof steadier. The dark less absolute than it once was. And still, somewhere deep beneath the habits of the age, the body keeps one small pact with uncertainty. It does not surrender itself entirely. It rests, but conditionally. It lets go, but not forever. That may be why the night can still feel so ancient even in the safest rooms. In darkness, the distances between centuries narrow. The mind that worries about tomorrow is carried by a nervous system that once worried only about surviving until dawn. And those two histories meet each time the eyes open without explanation. For a few moments, the modern person is not just an individual lying awake in a quiet house. They are also the latest expression of a much older creature, one shaped by weather, by danger, by kin sleeping nearby, by failing embers, by sounds at the edge of camp, by the knowledge that the world continues while one sleeps. There is no final neat answer waiting in that darkness. Sleep was never simple enough for that. It belongs to biology, but also to memory, custom, fear, hope, and the changing forms of human life. What survives through all those layers is the soft persistence of vigilance, the body's reluctance to disappear too completely, too trustingly, for too long. Sometimes that vigilance becomes exhausting. Sometimes it becomes suffering. Sometimes it's no more than a brief glance upward from the depths of sleep, a check so old it no longer knows its own origin, but it remains. And perhaps that is the image worth leaving behind. Not the sleepless clock glowing in a modern room, not the frustration of counting lost hours, but a quieter picture. A human being lies in darkness, far beyond the room, beyond the city, beyond the age itself, stretches the long inheritance of nights that shape the species. Wind moving over grass, smoke rising from a fire, the sound of others breathing close by, a child turning in sleep, a distant call no one can quite place, then stillness. Then the brief return of consciousness, not dramatic, not even fully afraid, only attentive, a small act of listening carried forward across thousands of generations, Eventually sleep comes back, as it usually does. The body yields again to its old bargain. Morning will arrive. The room will recover its ordinary scale. The strange weight of the hour will pass. But some faint part of the night remains in us, a reminder that humans did not come from a world of perfect rest. They came from a world that required them to sleep and listen at the same time, and they have never entirely stopped doing either.